Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Settle in wherever you happen to be tonight. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears, and let the day you have had begin, very slowly, to loosen its hold. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere at all that you need to be. Tonight we are not going to stand at the counter of a busy shop in the full light of a trading day, with callers pressing at the door and coins clicking on the board. We are going to arrive a little later than that. We are going to arrive at the hour when the last customer has finally gone, when the light in the street has thinned to the color of weak tea, and the apothecary reaches up to draw the first of his shutters closed. From that moment until the last candle is finally snuffed, we are going to stay inside with him and with the boy who sweeps his floor, and do nothing more strenuous than watch the shop being put quietly to rest. We will watch him tot up the day in his book by candlelight and refill the great painted jars along his shelves and set his tinctures to steep in their slow spirit. We will watch the syrups skimmed on the low fire and the still left dripping in the back room, and the delicate scales balanced grain by grain for an order the physician wants ready by morning. We will listen once or twice for the night bell that may or may not ring, and we will follow the master on his last slow round of the shelves before he banks the fire and takes the candle up the stair. There is no need to remember any of this. Not the names of the jars, not the order of the work, not a single fact that drifts by. Let your attention come and go exactly as it pleases. We have a long, unhurried evening ahead of us, and none of it will mind in the least if you slip away partway through and leave the rest until morning. Let us begin, then, with the shop itself in the last quiet hour before it closes. Picture a narrow shop, one of a leaning row of them, on a street of an old walled town somewhere in the middle years of Europe. It is not grand. Its front is little more than a wide wooden opening onto the street, closed at night by a heavy shutter that folds down by day into a broad flat counter, so that half the trade is done leaning across the sill with one foot still on the cobbles. Above the opening hangs a painted board, and beneath the board, on a bracket, hangs the sign that everyone in the quarter knows the shop by. Step through, and the light changes at once, and so does the air. The air is the first thing a stranger noticed, and the thing every old account returns to. It was warm and thick and layered, sweetness laid over bitterness, laid over something faintly resinous underneath. There was the honey and boiled sugar of the syrups, the sharp clean burn of spirits of wine, the dust of dried roots and barks, the green of hung herbs, and, threaded through all of it, the particular perfume of the spices that made an apothecary's stock so valuable: cinnamon and clove and nutmeg and pepper, kept behind the counter with the care of coin. People who grew up near such a shop remembered the smell of it all their lives, long after they had forgotten almost everything else about the street. The eye took longer to settle because there was so much to rest upon. Along every wall ran shelves, and along every shelf stood jars, hundreds of them, ranked as neatly as choir stalls. The finest were of tin-glazed earthenware, painted in blue and yellow and ochre, each with a Latin name lettered across a little scroll on its belly, so that the shelves read to anyone who could read them, like the index of a great book of remedies. Some jars were tall and wasted for syrups, with a lip for pouring and a lid tied down over wax cloth. Others were squat and wide for conserves and electuaries, the thick sweet pastes that a spoon stood upright in. Behind the counter, a whole bank of small wooden drawers held the drugs that came as roots and seeds and dried leaf, each drawer with its own painted name and its own faint particular smell when it was drawn open. Over all of it, from a beam in the low ceiling, hung the shop's strangest ornament and its proudest. It was a crocodile, or something that had once been a crocodile, dried and darkened and gently turning in whatever draught came through the door. No one entirely agreed on why an apothecary hung such a creature over his customers' heads. Some said it stood for the far places his rarest wares had travelled from, the deserts and the great hot rivers at the edge of the known world. Some said it was simply the grandest thing a man of the trade could own, a way of telling every caller, without a word, that here was a shop that dealt in wonders as well as in ordinary cures for an ordinary cough. Whatever the reason, it hung there in shop after shop across half of Europe, and the boy who swept the floor beneath it had long since stopped looking up at it at all. On the counter itself stood the emblem of the whole trade, the great mortar, a heavy bell of bronze or of hard stone, with its pestle resting inside it. Beside it lay the small brass scales, and a horn spoon, and a bone spatula worn thin at one edge, and a folded cloth, and the day's open book with the ink not yet dry in it. This counter was the border between two worlds. On the street side stood whoever had come with a trouble. On the shop side stood the master, and behind him the shelves, and behind the shelves the low door to the workroom, where the real slow labour of the trade went on out of sight. Set a little apart from the ordinary stock, in the place of honour a shop kept for its costliest wares, stood the great jars of the compound medicines that had made the trade its name. Chief among them was the wide, richly painted pot of theriac, the ancient treacle of many dozens of ingredients that we shall come to properly later in the evening. A medicine so prized and so laborious to make that its jar was often the most beautiful object in the whole shop, and its level watched as carefully as a messer watched his strongbox. Beside it might stand the mithridate, and the great electuaries, and the conserves of roses and of violets, each in its own vessel, each standing for weeks of patient work and a small fortune in sugar and spice. A customer's eye was meant to be drawn to these, and to understand, without being told, that a shop which could make such things could surely be trusted with a simple cough. Behind the counter, where no customer's hand could reach, were the drawers and boxes that held the shop's true wealth. The spices came first, locked or half hidden, for pepper and cinnamon and clove and nutmeg were worth their weight in silver, and were weighed out with the same small scales that measured medicine. Then the seeds, the resins, the dried and precious animal stuffs, the musk, and the little stoppered pots of things, a few grains of which might cost more than a labourer earned in a week. An apothecary's back shelf was, in its quiet way, one of the richest square yards in the whole town, and he knew to a scruple what stood upon it, and locked the better part of it away each night, without ever seeming to hurry. There was a basin of water in one corner, and a rough towel, for the trade was a dirty one for all its sweetness, and hands that had ground root and mixed ointment all day needed washing before they touched the fine things. There was a stool and a high desk, and pegs for the master's apron and the boys. And somewhere about the shop, Almost always, there was a cat, kept less for company than for the serious business of the mice, who would otherwise have made free with every seed drawer and every sugared conserve in the place. Tonight the cat was already curled on the warm stone near the hearth, having finished its own day's work earlier and with far less fuss than anyone. The counter itself told the story of the day, if a man cared to read it. There was a faint drift of powder along one edge, where something had been weighed and spilled, a pale ring where a wet pot had stood, a scatter of seed too small to trouble with until the sweeping. The wood was worn into a shallow hollow in the very place where 10,000 transactions had been leaned upon and slid across, smooth and pale as a river stone. By the long low light of the failing day, every one of these small marks stood out in soft relief, the honest wear of a working surface, and the apothecary rested both hands flat upon it for a moment, the way a man rests his hands on the neck of a horse he has ridden a long way before he lifts them and gets on. Into this shop, in the last light of the day, came the final customer. There was almost always a final customer, someone who arrived just as the master was thinking of the shutters. A servant sent from a house across the square, a woman with a child on her hip, an old man who had waited until the shop was quiet on purpose, so that he might describe his complaint without half the street listening in. The apothecary did not hurry them. It was understood, in a good shop, that the last caller of the day received the same slow attention as the first, and perhaps a little more, since there was no one now waiting behind them. Suppose, tonight, that it is a maid-servant sent by her mistress for a syrup against the household's autumn coughs. She sets a small covered pot on the counter to be filled, and a coin beside it, and gives her message carefully, the way she has been told it, twice over on the walk down the hill so as not to forget. The apothecary listens, nods, and reaches without looking to exactly the tall, wasted jar he wants, because his hand has gone to that same jar 10,000 times. He untees its cover, dips his ladle, and fills the little pot to the line. And while he works, he asks after the child who has the worst of the cough, and tells her, quietly, to give it warm and last thing at night, and not to be alarmed if the child sleeps deeply after. For that was the whole point of it. She takes her pot and her mistress's message of thanks, and steps back over the sill into the blue evening, and the shop is, at last, empty of everyone but the two who live and work in it. The apothecary stands a moment behind his counter in the settling quiet. He does not close the shutter yet. He lets the last of the daylight lie a while longer across the worn wood, and looks along his shelves the way a shepherd looks along a hillside at dusk, counting without counting, and finding everything more or less where it should be. Then he wipes the ladle, sets it down, and turns at last to the long business of closing. We turn now to the shutters and to the small daily ceremony of shutting the shop against the coming night. The first act of closing was to bring in the world, and then to shut it out. The wide shutter that had been the counter all day was lifted back up on its hinges from the street, and this alone changed the whole feeling of the room. For the noise of the town, the carts and the calling and the church bells and the gossip, was now held gently at arm's length behind a thickness of oak. The bar dropped into its bracket with a sound the apprentice could have named in his sleep, a soft wooden knock that meant more than any clock that the day's trade was over and the evening's quieter work had begun. Where a shop had glazed windows, and by the later centuries many town shops did, the small leaded panes were shuttered over from within, plank by plank, until the last coin of daylight was pinched out, and the only light left was the light the household made for itself. In poorer shops with no glass at all, only the folding front and a grille, the closing was simpler and even more complete, a single heavy fold of timber between the remedies and the street, barred and pegged and leaned upon once to be sure. Either way, the same thing happened to the room. It drew in on itself. It became smaller and warmer, and wholly private, and the jars that had faced outward to the customer all day seemed now to face inward, toward the fire and the counter and the two people left to tend them. Outside, meanwhile, the town was performing its own version of the same ritual, and the sounds of it came muffled through the shutters. Somewhere a bell was ringing the hour that told honest people to be turning homeward. The curfew bell, the couvre-feu, whose very name meant to cover the fire. For its first purpose in the old towns had been less about people than about flames. A nightly command to bank down every open hearth so that the crowded timber streets might sleep without burning. The apothecary, whose whole shop was full of oils and spirits and dry-hung herbs, took that particular bell more seriously than most of his neighbors. Fire was the one caller he could not afford to admit. He would hear, too, if he listened, the watch beginning their round, the slow tread and the low exchange of men whose task was to walk the sleeping streets until dawn, to call the hours, and to notice the things that ought not to be happening in the dark. A light still burning late in an apothecary's back room was a familiar sight to the watch, and an untroubling one, for they knew as well as anyone that a shop of this kind kept its own hours, and that a lamp behind the shutters at midnight most likely meant nothing worse than a syrup that could not be left off the fire, or an order that a physician wanted made up before he called for it in the morning. The sign outside swung a little as the wind came up with the dark. Every apothecary hung one, for most of his customers could not read the fine Latin on his jars, and a shop was known by its picture far more than by any name above the door. The mortar and pestle became, in the end, the sign of the whole trade, but there were others older and stranger. Some shops hung the long twisted tusk of what was sold as a unicorn's horn, in truth the tooth of a sea creature of the far north, a marvel worth a fortune and a promise to anyone who saw it swinging there, that this shop dealt in the rarest cures of all. Others showed a great gilded pine cone, or a green branch, or the arms of the guild the master belonged to. The sign creaked on its bracket now, back and forth, one of the last small movements outside as the street emptied. There were rules, too, that governed this hour, though no one stood over the master to enforce them but his own conscience and the long memory of his neighbors. The guild he belonged to, the fellowship of apothecaries and spicers that licensed his trade and guarded its good name, expected a shop to keep honest hours and to deal honestly within them. A man was not to adulterate his wares, not to sell the old stock as new, not to weigh light, and not, as a rule, to trade after the shutters were up, save in the true emergencies that the trade existed to answer. The oath a young man swore when he was made free of the craft bound him to all of this, and the closing of the shop each night was, in a small way, a daily keeping of that promise, the drawing of a line under a day's dealing, that he was content to have any inspector of the guild examine. The care of the fire came next, and it was no small matter in a shop like this. Every open flame was now accounted for and considered. The great hearth where the syrups simmered was not put out, for the night's work still needed it, but it was watched and reduced and hedged about with care, and nothing that might catch was left near it. Loose herbs were moved back, the spirits of wine, which took a flame more eagerly than anything else in the shop, were stoppered and set well away from the heat. In many towns the law required a household to be able to cover its fire entirely at the curfew bell, and though an apothecary's trade won him a quiet exception, he honored the spirit of the rule with real attention, knowing better than any of his neighbors how quickly his own shelves would burn. Along the street, the other shops were closing in the same hour, and a man standing in the middle of the way could hear the whole quarter shutting itself up for the night. The knock of shutter after shutter, the scrape of a bar, a called good night, a dog settling, a last cart going home over the stones. It was a companionable sound, the sound of a town lying down together, and the apothecary, alone now inside his barred front, was never quite as alone as the silence of his own shop made him feel. Beyond his walls 100 other families were performing the same small rites of ending the day. Somewhere a last bell rang, softer than the curfew, the bell that called the religious of the town to the final office of the day. The prayers said as the light failed. The apothecary might murmur something of his own at this hour, a few words learned in childhood, half prayer and half habit, spoken over the shop and the work and the night ahead. Many in his trade held that the making of medicine was a work blessed in itself, a small share in the mending of a broken world, and that a remedy set to steep with a quiet word over it was the better for the word. Whether or not that was so, the murmur cost nothing and settled something, and it belonged to this hour as surely as the drawing of the bar. Within, the apothecary lit the first candle of the evening from the embers of the day, and the whole geography of the room shifted again in its light. By daylight the shop had been a broad, bright place of trade, every jar plainly lettered, every customer plainly seen. By candlelight it became a place of pools and shadows, a warm ring of gold around the counter and the fire, and beyond it the tall, dim ranks of jars fading up into a darkness where the crocodile hung unseen. The master had spent so many thousand evenings in exactly this light that he no longer needed the far shelves to be lit at all. His hands knew the dark end of the shop as well as the bright, and could find, without a candle, the one jar in 100 that a late knock might send him searching for. He set the candle in its holder on the counter, drew a long breath of the warm and complicated air, and looked about him at the shut and settled shop. The day was gone. The street was barred out. There remained only the book to be reckoned, the floor to be swept, the jars to be tended, and the slow night work to be set going. All of it as familiar to him as his own breathing, and all of it, tonight, ours to watch. Let us turn now to the book, and to the master sitting down at last with his day laid out before him in ink. The master drew the high stool to the counter, set the candle where its light would fall square on the page, and opened the book that held the whole shape of the day. Every well-kept shop had such a book, and often more than one. There was the rough book, the waste book as some called it, scrawled in through the day between customers, a hurried line for each thing sold and each thing owed, no neater than it needed to be. And there was the fair book, the ledger proper, into which those hurried lines were copied out in the evening in a steadier hand, each set down under its right name and its right sum, so that a man might know, at any quarter of the year, exactly how his trade stood and who owed him what. Tonight it was the fair copying that lay before him, the day's scrawl to be turned into an orderly account by candlelight before it grew cold in his memory. He dipped the quill and began. A syrup against coughs, so much. A plaster for an old man's knee, so much. A drachm of this powder, an ounce of that root, a small pot of the green ointment for a burned hand, a measure of rose water carried off in a customer's own flask. Line by line the day came back to him as he wrote it, not as a string of numbers, but as a procession of faces and troubles, for he remembered his customers by their ailments as easily as by their names, and could no more have set down a sale without recalling the person than a shepherd could count his flock without knowing each sheep. The ink dried slow in the cool air. The candle leaned and steadied. Outside, the last cart had gone, and the only sound now was the small scratch of the quill and the settling of the fire. Not all of it was paid in coin, and this was the part of the reckoning that took the most patience. A good half of a country apothecary's trade, and a fair share of a town shop's, was done on trust and on barter, and the book had to hold all of it. Here a payment in eggs, set against a child's fever draught. There a promise of a day's carting at harvest, given for a winter's worth of salves. A weaver's account settled in a length of good cloth. A debt that a widow could not pay at all, carried forward one more quarter, as it had been carried forward the quarter before, and would be carried forward again, until at last, in some quiet later year, the master would draw his pen through it without a word to anyone and count the medicine as given rather than sold. The book recorded the barter and the credit as faithfully as the coin, for a trade built so much on trust could not afford to forget who had paid and who had not, and yet a good master was slow to press a poor debtor, knowing that the goodwill of a whole quarter was worth more to him in the end than any single unpaid sum. There was learning tucked into these pages too, though it was never meant as learning. An apothecary who kept his book well could see, across a year of it, which remedies his neighbours truly reached for, and which sat untouched on the shelf. He could see the fevers rise in the account, as the fevers rose in the streets. The coughs thicken in the ledger with the coming of the wet months, the small steady traffic of stomach troubles and aching joints and sleepless nights that made up the true daily business of healing far more than any dramatic cure. Some masters, looking back through their own old books, learned to lay in a heavier stock of a particular herb before the season that always called for it. The plague of a bad autumn written plainly in the ink of the autumn before. The book was, in this quiet way, a record of the health of a whole town, kept without anyone ever intending it to be one. A handful of such books have survived the centuries, tucked away in the muniment rooms of old towns and the chests of old families, and to turn their brittle pages now is to hear a whole vanished street speak again in the language of small sums. They record the price of pepper in a hard year, and the price of it in an easy one. They record a physician's grand order for a wealthy patient set down on the same page as a ha'porth of some common herb sold to a servant, the two of them equal before the honest reckoning of the book. And here and there, between the sums, a master noted something else entirely: the birth of a child, the death of an old customer, the weather on a remarkable day, so that the account book became, without meaning to, a kind of diary of the shop, and the only voice in which many a long-dead apothecary still speaks to us at all. A part of the book stood a little apart from the rest, and that was the account of the physicians. In a town of any size, the apothecary did not work alone. Above him in the ordering of the healing arts stood the learned physician, a university man who examined the sick, judged their humors, and wrote out in his own hand the recipe that the apothecary was then to compound. These physicians' orders were a good and steady part of the trade, and they were entered with particular care, for they were billed not always to the sick person, but sometimes to the physician himself, or to a great house that kept both physician and apothecary upon its books together. The standing between the two trades was not always an easy one, the physician holding himself the master, and the apothecary the mere hand that mixed. Yet in the daily working of a town, the two leaned upon each other far more than either quite admitted, and many an apothecary, asked quietly by a poor family who could never afford a physician's fee, gave what plain and cautious counsel he safely could across his own counter, and entered the small sum for the remedy in his book without ever entering the advice that had gone with it. The prices themselves were a delicate matter, and the book had to hold them justly. Some of what the apothecary sold had cost him very little, a common herb gathered from the hedgerow for the price of the gathering alone. Some had cost him a very great deal, a spice carried half across the world, a resin wept from a tree in a country he would never see, a compound that had taken weeks of skilled labor to prepare. The apothecary's bill became, in the humor of the age, a byword for length and for dearness, and there was some justice in the jest, for the making of fine medicine was genuinely costly, and the finished remedy could not be cheap. Yet a fair master priced by a fair rule, often the very rule the guild itself laid down, and set his sums in the book by that rule, so that a customer who questioned a charge might be shown, plainly, what the thing had cost, and what small honest gain the shop had taken upon it. Here and there in the margin, as he copied, the master made a small note to himself of another kind, not of money but of stock. This jar near empty, that drawer running low, a root not to be had again until the digging season came round once more, a spice merchant expected at the next fair, and a list to be ready against his coming. These marginal notes were the shop's memory of its own needs, and a careful master read them back to himself often, so that he was never caught short of a common remedy in the very season that called for it most. The book thus looked two ways at once, back over the day that was done, and forward to the days still coming. And the few quiet minutes he spent upon these notes now saved him many an awkward moment across the counter later, when a customer's need and an empty jar might otherwise have met. When the day was fully copied and reckoned, the master sanded the wet ink, blew the fine grit away, and turned back a page or two to be sure that yesterday agreed with itself, and that no sum had been left hanging. He did not hurry this. A false figure found tonight was a small trouble. The same figure found at the quarter's end, tangled into 100 others, was a long evening's misery. So he checked and squared, and only when the account stood true did he close the book and lay the quill across it, and sit a moment in the candlelight with the whole day settled and accounted for behind him. The reckoning was done. The shop owed nothing to the day that it had not paid, and the day owed nothing to the shop that the book did not remember. Let us turn now to the boy, and to the broom, and to the quiet sweeping that ended every working day. While the master had bent over his book, the apprentice had been about the last of his own long list of duties, and the sound of his broom had made a soft, steady rhythm under the scratch of the quill. Every apothecary's shop had its apprentice, or hoped to, for the trade could not be learned from books alone, and had always been passed, like the wise woman's own craft, from a pair of skilled hands into a pair of willing ones. The boy was bound to his master by an indenture, a folded and sealed agreement that gave over the better part of his youth, 7 years most commonly, sometimes 8, in exchange for the whole of a trade. He lived in the master's house, ate at the master's table, and slept, more often than not, in a corner of the shop or the room above it, so that he was never far from the work by day or the wares by night. The indenture itself made careful reading, and its terms tell us a great deal about what the apprentice's life was truly like. He was to serve his master faithfully, keep his secrets, and do him no damage. He was not to waste his master's goods, nor lend them unlawfully. He was not to haunt taverns or playhouses, not to game with dice or cards, not to marry within his term, and not to absent himself by day or night without leave. In return, the master bound himself to teach the boy the art and mystery of the trade, hiding nothing of it, and to find him meat and drink and lodging, and, in many agreements, to see him decently clothed and taught his letters besides. It was a hard bargain by the measure of a later age, and yet it was also, for a boy of the middling sort, one of the surest roads there was out of a small life and into a respected one. The sweeping was the humblest of his tasks and, in its way, one of the most careful. The floor at the end of a working day was a scattered map of everything the shop had done, a drift of spilled powder here, a scatter of seed there, fragments of dried leaf and shavings of root, and the fine bitter dust that rose from the mortar and settled on everything by evening. A careless boy sent this all to the midden together. A well-taught one swept it into the light first and looked at what he had gathered, for some of it was worth the saving, a spill of a costly powder swept clean off a scrubbed board and returned to its jar, a scatter of good seed picked from the chaff. What could not be saved was gathered and carried out, and the boards were left clean for the morning, so that the first customer of the next day should find the shop as fresh, as if no work had ever been done in it at all. There was far more to his learning than the broom, of course, and the sweeping was only the last quiet task of a day that had begun before the master rose. The apprentice fetched and carried the water, tended and fed the fire, ground in the great mortar until his arms ached, washed the pots and the presses and the sieves, ran the errands that carried him all over the town, and stood at the master's elbow through every compounding he was trusted to watch, learning the names and the smells and the dangers of 100 drugs, long before he was allowed to touch the most of them. He learned his Latin as he went, enough to read the jars and the recipes, and he learned the weights and the measures until the small symbols for scruple and drachm and ounce were as plain to him as his own name. It was a slow schooling, and a thorough one, and it left almost nothing to chance. At the far end of it lay the guild and the long climb to mastery. When his years were served, the apprentice did not simply become a master. He became first a journeyman, a made man of the craft, who might work for wages in another's shop and gather the little store of money and skill he would need to stand on his own. Only later, and only if the fellowship judged him fit, might he be examined and admitted a master in his own right, free to open a shop, take apprentices of his own, and hang his own sign above his own door. In some places the examination was a searching one. The man questioned closely on his drugs and his recipes, sometimes set to compound a medicine before the examiner's own eyes, so that the guild might be sure no unfit hand was ever loosed upon the public's health. It was said in the trade that a good apothecary was 10 years in the making and a lifetime in the perfecting, and the boy now leaning tired on his broom in the candlelight was somewhere near the beginning of that long road. The errands alone would have filled a lesser day. The apprentice was the shop's legs, sent out into the town on a dozen small missions between his indoor tasks, to carry a made-up remedy to a house that could not send for it, to fetch a fresh supply of some herb from the woman who grew it, to run a message to the physician, to buy honey or wine, or the clean sand and coal the still and the fire required. Through these errands the boy came to know the whole town as few others did, every lane and every back door, which households were sick and which were mending, who paid promptly and who must be gently reminded. He carried the shop's good name through the streets on his own 2 feet, and a master chose his apprentice partly for this, wanting a boy who would be trusted and welcomed at every door he was sent to. With the sweeping done, there remained the washing, and this too was the apprentice's charge. The pots and pans of the day's work. The small ones the ointments had been mixed in, the ladles and the horn spoons, the sieves clogged with the pale ghost of a powder, the presses still sticky with the last of a pressing. All had to be brought clean before the morning, for nothing spoiled a fine remedy faster than a foul vessel, and no rule of the trade was drilled harder into a young apprentice than the plain necessity of clean tools. He scoured them in the basin, and set them to drain, and hung the ladles back upon their nails, and each thing went back to its own place. For a shop where every tool had its place was a shop where a master could lay his hand upon what he needed even in the dark, and more than one late emergency was met the sooner for it. For all its hardness, the apprentice's road led somewhere worth the walking, and the boy knew it. More than one great name of the healing arts had begun exactly here, a tired boy with a broom, bound for years to a master's counter, learning the trade from the floor upward. It was a path by which a poor but clever child might climb into the settled and respected middle of a town, a householder in his turn, a master with apprentices of his own, a man whose word upon a remedy the whole quarter would come to trust. The boy sweeping the last of the dust into the light tonight held that distant possibility somewhere in the back of his tired mind, as such boys always had, and it made the broom and the water and the endless grinding at the mortar a little lighter to carry. Tonight, though he was simply a tired boy at the end of a long day, and the master, closing his book, saw it, and did not keep him at his work a moment longer than the sweeping needed. There was a plainness of feeling between master and apprentice that the strictness of the indenture could not quite conceal. The man had been such a boy himself, once, sweeping another master's floor by another candle, and he remembered exactly how the last hour of the day felt to young bones. So when the boards were clean, he sent the boy to set the broom in its corner, and to see to the one or two small tasks that must be done before the deeper work of the evening began, and the sweeping was over, and the shop stood clean and quiet, and ready for whatever the night would ask of it. Let us turn now to the shelves and to the slow, satisfying work of setting the jars to rights. The apothecary took up the candle and moved along his shelves, and this was, of all the evening's tasks, perhaps the one he loved best, for it asked nothing of him but attention, and returned to him the whole slow comfort of his stock set in order. By day the jars were opened and dipped into, and closed again in the hurry of trade, a little taken here, a little there, and by evening a good many of them stood lower than they should. The night was the time to set them right, to bring up the working supply from the deeper stores, and top each jar to its proper level, so that the morning found every remedy ready to the master's hand, and no customer was ever kept waiting while a boy was sent scrambling to the cellar for more. The jars themselves were a study, and no two shops arranged them quite alike, though every shop followed the same broad sense. The tall, waisted vessels for the syrups stood together, their glaze bright with painted flowers and scrolls, each lettered with the name of the syrup it held, of roses, of violets, of poppy, of the coughing herb. The squat, wide pots held the conserves and the electuaries, thick and sweet and slow to pour. The plainer earthen jars and the little glazed gallipots held the ointments and the salves. And ranked behind and above them all stood the specie jars, the drugs in their dried and simple state, the roots and barks and seeds and leaves, each waiting to be ground or steeped or boiled into something a sick body could take. Every jar bore its name, and the reading of those names was itself a small art. The lettering was in Latin, and much of it in the clipped abbreviations of the trade, a word begun and then broken off with a stroke, so that a stranger might make nothing of the shelves at all while the master read them as easily as a page of plain speech. This root, that flower, the dried body of this or that, a powder simple, a powder compound. The abbreviations were a language within a language, learned in the long apprentice years, and they let a whole cupboard of learning be carried on the bellies of a few hundred little pots. The apothecary passed his candle along them now, reading without seeming to read, his eye catching at once upon any jar that stood too low. The working jars on the shelves were only the visible part of the stock. Behind the shop, in a cool back room or a dry cellar, lay the true stores, the sacks and chests and bales from which the pretty jars were filled. Here the bulk of everything was kept away from the light and the damp, the great quantities bought at fair or from a travelling merchant, laid up against a whole season's trade. The evening's refilling was a carrying up from this hidden wealth into the bright ranks of the shelves, a scoop of dried flowers into the wasted jar, a measure of powdered root into the drawer, a fresh gallipot of ointment set beside the one that was nearly spent. What the customer saw was orderly and finite. What lay behind it was the real depth of the shop, and a good master knew the level of his back stores as surely as he knew the level of his jars. As he refilled, he judged. Not everything that came up from the store was still fit to sell, for drugs did not keep forever, and a conscientious master was as ready to condemn a spoiled thing as to sell a good one. He looked and he smelled, for the nose told him most of what he needed to know. A dried herb gone brown and lifeless had lost its virtue and would do no one any good. A powder gone damp and caked, a conserve touched with the first grey bloom of mould, a root bored through by some small creature of the store, all of these he set aside without regret. For the trade lived on trust, and a single spoiled remedy sold could undo a lifetime of good dealing. It was said among careful masters that the drugs a man threw away told you as much about him as the ones he sold, and that the surest sign of a poor shop was a jar no one had looked into for a year. There was an older discipline behind this, too, one the trade called garbling, the patient cleaning of a drug of everything that was not the drug itself. A dried herb came full of stalk and grit, and the odd stray leaf of something else entirely. A parcel of seed carried its own chaff. Before such things were fit for the fine work of medicine, they had to be picked over and cleaned, and in the great towns this mattered so much that an officer was appointed to see it done, a garbler of spices whose task was to search the merchant's stores and condemn what was foul or falsely mixed. In the shop, the same care was kept in small. The apprentice set of an evening to pick a dish of dried flowers clean of their stalks, or to sift a costly powder free of grit, so that what went into the jar was the pure thing and nothing less. The oldest stock was always drawn upon first, and this simple rule governed the whole refilling. A master who let his fresh supply be used, while the old sat forgotten behind it, would find, soon enough, a jar of spoiled and useless drug at the back of every shelf, and a great waste of good money with it. So the new was set behind the old, always, and the old brought forward to be used, and the stock moved through the shop in a slow and orderly tide, the freshest thing furthest from the customer's reach, and the oldest fit thing nearest to hand. It was a plain economy, learned early and kept for life, and it was one of the quiet reasons a well-run shop could sell good medicine at a fair price, while a careless one could not. The sealing of the jars was as much a part of the refilling as the filling itself, for the great enemy of a dried drug was the damp, and a jar left carelessly open would draw moisture out of the very air of an evening and spoil its contents by slow degrees. So each jar, once brought to its level, was closed again with care. A disc of waxed cloth, or a piece of soft bladder tied down over its mouth, or a fitted lid set snug into place, and the fine syrups and the costly spices sealed tightest of all. In a wet season the master watched his stock the more closely, for a run of damp weeks could soften a powder or cloud a syrup faster than a whole year of dry ones. And he would sometimes bring a jar nearer the fire for a night to draw the moisture gently out of it before it did any harm. Now and again, as he went along the shelves, the master found a label worn or faded past easy reading, the confident Latin softened by years of handling into a ghost of itself, and he set that jar aside to be lettered afresh. A misread jar was a danger in a trade like his, where one dried root looked much like another, and only the name told them apart. And so the names were kept clear and legible, as a matter of plain safety. In some shops the relettering was the master's own careful work, done of a quiet evening with a fine brush, and in others it was trusted to an apprentice with a good hand, a small honor that told the boy his letters were at last thought fit to stand upon the shop's own shelves. To draw open one of the little wooden drawers behind the counter was to be met, each time, by a particular and unmistakable smell, and the master knew every one of them blind. The drawer of aniseed breathed out its warm sweetness. The drawer of valerian gave up its heavy earthy scent that the cat, oddly, seemed to love. The bitter drawers, the wormwood and the rue, announced themselves sharply the moment they were pulled. A master with his eyes shut could have named half his stock by the nose alone, and an apprentice was tested in exactly this way. Handed a pinch of something and asked to name it blind, until the whole materia of the shop lived in his memory, as surely by smell as by sight. The depth of a shop's stock told you much about the town it stood in. A great town apothecary, near a port or upon a trade road, might keep a wall of jars a stranger could scarcely count. Drugs from the Far East, and the New World among them, things a country healer would never so much as see. A small country shop kept a plainer store. The common herbs and the few bought spices a modest parish could afford, and leaned far more upon what grew in its own garden and hedgerow than upon what came by ship. Yet both, the great and the small, kept the same evening discipline over what they had, the same topping and sealing and judging, for the plainest stock kept in good order served a town better than the richest stock left to spoil. A few of these great painted jars have outlived by centuries every drug they ever held, and stand now in the cases of museums, bright and cool and empty, their Latin names still legible across their bellies. To look at them is to see the shelves of this evening exactly as they were, the blue and the ochre and the yellow, the scrolls and the flowers, the clipped and confident lettering of a trade that has otherwise almost wholly passed away. They were made to be beautiful as well as useful, for a shop's jars were its face to the world, and a master took a real pride in a fine set of them, handed down sometimes from one owner to the next along with the shop itself, so that the same jar might hold the same remedy under 3 or 4 masters across 100 years. When the last jar stood at its proper level, and the last spoiled thing had been set aside for the midden, the master stepped back and let the candle rest a moment on the whole bright wall of his stock. It was a good feeling, and a very old one. The feeling of a store laid in and set in order against whatever the morning might bring. The same feeling a farmer had looking at a full barn, or a housewife at a stocked larder. The shop was provisioned. Every common trouble that might walk through the door tomorrow had its answer already waiting on the shelf. And with that quiet satisfaction settled in him, he turned from the jars to the tools that had served the day, and to the plainer work of making them clean. Let us turn now to the mortar, and to the careful cleaning of the tools before they are put by for the night. The great mortar stood on the counter where it always stood, heavy as a small anvil, the very emblem and heart of the whole trade. In it through the day, the drugs had been broken and beaten and ground to powder, the roots and the barks, the dried leaves and the hard seeds, everything that had to be made fine before it could be made into medicine. It was the busiest tool in the shop, and the one whose cleaning mattered most, for a mortar carried, in its scarred hollow, the faint memory of everything that had lately been ground in it, and the whole art of the evening's cleaning was to leave it carrying nothing at all. Mortars came in many substances, and each had its use. The great ones of bronze or bell metal, cast heavy and often beautifully, cast sometimes with the master's name and a date about their rims, were for the hard daily work of breaking roots and seeds, and rang, when the pestle struck them, with a low clear note that carried out into the street. Those of marble and of hard stone were kinder to delicate things, and did not taint them with any taste of metal. Those of stout wood were kept for gums and sticky resins that would have clung and clogged in stone. And a small one of glass, or of the finest glazed ware, was kept apart for the most delicate and the most dangerous work of all, where nothing must be allowed to soak into the vessel and pass on to the next thing ground in it. The pestle matched its mortar, and the two were a married pair, worn to each other's shape over long years of use. Chief among the rules of the mortar was the rule of the poisons, and the master kept it without fail. A mortar in which a dangerous drug had been ground was never simply wiped and used again, for the least trace of some substances was enough to do harm, and a powder for a child ground carelessly after a powder of some strong thing might carry that strong thing along with it. So the dangerous drugs had their own mortar, kept apart, marked, and cleaned with a special care, or else the common mortar was scarred after them with a thoroughness that left nothing behind. This was one of the first and gravest lessons an apprentice learned, and a master watched to see that the boy had truly taken it in, for a whole shop's good name, and worse, could hang upon it. The cleaning itself was patient work. The mortar was scoured with sand and a little water, or wiped with bread, which took up a powder wonderfully, and then washed, and dried, and set ready. The pestle was cleaned along with it, and the sieves, which the trade called cerces, were tapped and brushed clean of the fine powder that clung in their cloth or their fine drawn skin. These cerces were how a powder was graded, shaken through a finer or a coarser mesh, until it was as fine as the recipe required. Some medicines wanting a coarse bruised powder, and some the finest dust that would float on a breath, and each cerce had to be brought clean of one drug before it was used upon the next. The other small tools followed. The presses in which juices and oils were squeezed from herb and seed were taken apart and cleaned of their pulp and dried, for a press left foul would sour the next thing put in it. The spatulas and the flat knives with which ointments were worked and spread were scraped and wiped. The chopping board was scarred. The little brass scales, which we shall come to properly a little later in the evening, were dusted of the least clinging grain, and their pans wiped bright. Even the horn spoons and the bone lifters had their moment at the basin. One by one the servants of the day's work were made clean and whole again, and set each in its own place ready. There was a plain wisdom in doing all of this at night, rather than leaving it for the morning. Tools cleaned while the memory of their use was fresh were cleaned properly, each known for exactly what it had last held. Tools left dirty overnight dried hard, and grew far more trouble to bring clean, and worse. A master coming to his work in the morning press of trade might snatch up a mortar, or a cerce still foul from yesterday, and carry a trace of one remedy into another before he had even noticed. So the cleaning belonged to the evening, to the quiet, unhurried hour, when there was time to do it thoroughly. And a shop that kept this discipline was a shop whose medicines could be trusted grain for grain. There was a real craft in the grinding itself, more than a stranger watching the plane up and down of the pestle would have guessed. To break a hard root was one motion, a firm pounding straight down. To reduce a thing already broken to a fine and even powder was another, a patient turning and rubbing of the pestle around the bowl. The powder swept in from the sides again and again, so that all of it might be worked alike. Some things ground easily, and some fought the pestle to the last, and the trade knew its tricks for each. A hard gum chilled to make it brittle, a tough root cut small and dried before ever it met the mortar, a little of some dry powder, added to a thing too oily to grind clean on its own. The apprentice's arm learned all of this slowly, through many an aching hour, until the work that had exhausted him at first became a steady, almost restful rhythm. How fine a thing was ground depended wholly upon what it was to become. A powder to be taken as it was, stirred into wine or folded into honey, was ground and sifted to the finest dust, that it might be smooth upon the tongue and easy to swallow. A herb that was only to be boiled into a decoction was bruised and broken, but no more. For the water would draw out its virtue well enough without the labor of a fine grinding. A thing to be pressed for its oil was crushed, rather than powdered. So the mortar's work varied from drug to drug, and from remedy to remedy, and a master called for a coarse bruising or a fine flour, with a word the apprentice learned to obey exactly, knowing that the wrong fineness could spoil an otherwise perfect preparation. Even the water the tools were cleaned in was given a thought, where the day's work had touched anything dangerous. The scourings of a mortar in which a strong drug had been ground were not thrown down carelessly, where a beast might lap at them or a child might play, but poured well away, onto the midden or into the running gutter that carried the town's waste off toward the river. It was a small carefulness, easily forgotten, and a good master did not forget it. For the whole trust of his trade rested upon the plain principle that what was meant to heal in the right hands must be kept from doing harm in the wrong ones, down to the very rinsings of his pots. For all its plainness, the mortar carried a weight of feeling that no other tool in the shop quite matched. It was the sign hung over the door, the emblem stamped upon the guild's own arms, the thing a stranger pictured when he pictured the trade at all. A master's mortar was often the tool he had owned the longest, bought at the very outset of his working life, and kept to its end, worn smooth inside by the grinding of 40 years, and handed on at last, more often than not, to whoever took the shop after him. To clean it of an evening was, in a quiet way, to tend the heart of the whole place, and though the master would never have said so aloud, he handled it always with a care a little greater than the plain task required. Those great bronze mortars have proved almost as long-lived as the painted jars, and many survive, dark and heavy and still ringing true. Some with their maker's mark and the year of their casting plain about the rim. They were costly things and lasting ones, often the single most valuable tool a young master bought when he first set up his shop, and often the thing he was proudest to hand on. The low note of the pestle at work in the mortar was one of the common sounds of an old town's day, ringing from shop after-shop along a street of apothecaries, and a townsman walking home in the evening quiet might notice, without quite knowing why the street seemed so still, that all the mortars had at last fallen silent for the night. With the tools clean and dry and each in its place, the counter was clear again, wiped down, ready. The busy noise of the day's grinding and mixing was fully over, and what came next was quieter still, the setting going of the slow medicines, the ones that asked not for strength or skill in a single hour, but only for patience across many days. Let us turn now to the tinctures, and to the gentle art of setting a remedy to steep, and then leaving it, for weeks, entirely alone. The tinctures asked for the least labor of anything the master did all evening, and yet they were, in their way, among the most patient works of the whole trade, for they were made almost entirely of time. To set a tincture going was to marry a drug to a liquid, and then to do nothing at all, for weeks. But wait, the spirit drew the virtue slowly out of the herb or the root, hour upon hour, day upon day, until at last the clear liquid had taken into itself the strength and the color and the bitterness of the things steeped in it, and the spent solid could be strained away and thrown out, its goodness now wholly passed into the tincture. Of all the shop's medicines, these were the least hurried, and the evening, unhurried itself, was exactly their hour. The liquid a thing was steeped in decided a great deal, and the trade knew several. Chief among them was the spirit of wine, the strong clear distilled spirit that the shop made or bought at no small cost, prized because it drew out virtues that plain water never could, and because it kept a tincture sound and unspoiled for a very long time. Beyond it there were the milder steepings, herbs laid in good wine to make a medicated wine, or in vinegar to make a sharp and cleansing one, or in sweet oil set in the warm sun to make an infused oil for salves and for rubbing. Each liquid suited certain drugs and certain purposes, and the master chose among them by long habit, knowing which herb gave up its best in spirit, and which in oil, and which asked only for time in a jar of honest wine. It was worth pausing of an evening on the difference between these slow steepings and the quick ones, for the trade held them clearly apart, and so should we. An infusion was the work of a moment, near enough, hot water poured over a herb, and left only long enough to draw out its lighter virtues, the very thing a customer might be told to make at her own hearth from a twist of dried leaf. A decoction was a boiling. The harder roots and barks simmered in water until the water had taken their strength, a thing of an hour rather than a month. But the tincture and its cousins in wine and oil were the long work, the drawing out that no fire could hurry, and these were the ones set going at night and then left deliberately alone. The vessels stood ready for them along a shelf kept for this purpose, jars of glass where the master could watch the color deepen, or of stout glazed stoneware where he could not, but trusted the work all the same. Into each went the drug, cut or bruised to open it to the liquid, and then the liquid poured over until the solid was well covered, and then the mouth of the jar sealed tight against the air. A tincture left open to the air spoiled, or lost its spirit to the room by slow escape, and so the sealing mattered. A fitted stopper, a tied bladder, a disc of waxed cork pressed home. The master filled and sealed each jar with the same unhurried care, and set it in its place on the steeping shelf among its fellows, some newly begun, some halfway through their weeks, some very nearly ready to be strained. Warmth helped the work along gently, and the placing of the jars took account of it. A steeping set in a cold corner drew slowly. One set in a warm place, near the hearth though never upon it, or in a sunny window through the daylight hours, gave up its virtue the sooner. The master knew the warm corners of his shop as a cat knows them, and set his jars where the mild heat of the banked fire would reach them through the night, without ever growing hot enough to harm. Some steepings, the old book said, did best buried in warm sand, or set in a vessel of warm water, kept barely tepid for days together, and a shop that troubled to do this had its tinctures ready a little sooner, and, it was claimed, a little stronger. Each jar was labelled and, in a careful shop, dated, so that the master might know at a glance not only what steeped within, but how long it had steeped, and when it would be done. A tincture strained too soon was weak, its liquid not yet full of the drug. One left too long was no better, and merely tied up a good jar, and a measure of costly spirit past all need. So the dating mattered. A small mark scratched or written on the jar or noted against it in the book, and the master's eye ran along the steeping shelf of an evening reading these dates, as a gardener reads the ripening of his fruit. This one a week yet, this one ready on the morrow, this one to be strained tonight before he did anything else. For the steepings did not only need setting going. Some needed tending, and this was among the apprentice's standing duties, to shake or turn the jars each day so that the drug was not left to settle and steep unevenly at the bottom while the liquid above it did nothing. A daily turning kept the whole of the drug bathed and working, and a jar faithfully shaken gave a fuller tincture than one left still. It was the lightest of tasks, a moment's work as the boy passed along the shelf, and yet a forgotten week of it made a plain difference in the end, and a good master saw that it was not forgotten. The spirit of wine that made the best of these tinctures was itself a small marvel of the trade, and worth a word. It was won by distilling wine, driving off its strong, and burning part from its watery one, until what remained in the receiver was a clear liquid that took a flame readily and carried a bite the plain wine never had. The old makers called it by grand names, the water of life among them, and held it half a medicine in its own right, a few drops in warm wine, given to revive a fainting heart or warm a chilled body. That the same spirit which cheered a man could also draw the healing virtue out of a bitter root and hold it sound for years seemed to the trade a fine and fitting thing, and the shop guarded its store of it carefully, both for its cost and for the ready way it took fire. There was a whole cast of mind behind these slow medicines that set the apothecary a little apart from the impatient world. He worked in the tinctures on a scale of weeks and months, laying down tonight what would not be ready until a season had turned, trusting a work he could not watch and could not hurry. It asked a certain faith, this laying down of the slow remedies, the same faith a man needed to plant a tree whose shade he might never sit in, and the trade bred that faith into its people early. A young apprentice, all haste and eager hands, had to be taught the hardest lesson of the steeping shelf, which was simply to leave the jars alone, to trust the time, and to understand that here, at least, doing nothing was the whole of the work well done. Now and again a jar was set aside and, in the press of the trade, half forgotten, pushed to the back of the shelf behind newer work, and come upon again months later than it should have been. More often than not, the old books claim such a tincture was found none the worse for its long neglect, and sometimes the better, richer and darker and fuller than the master had meant it to be, as though the extra weeks had only deepened what the first weeks began. It was a small kindness of the trade, this forgiveness of the slow medicines, and it stood in gentle contrast to the syrups and the waters that must be watched every minute. For a tincture, once well begun and well sealed, could be trusted to look after itself in the dark for as long as it was left. With the new tinctures sealed and shelved, the ready ones strained and bottled, and the whole slow, working row of them set in its warm corner for the night, the master left them to their patient business and turned back toward the fire, where a different kind of work was waiting, one that could not be left alone for a moment. Let us turn now to the syrup pot and to the slow sweet labor of the skimming. The syrup pot sat over the low fire, and it was the one thing in the whole evening that could not be walked away from, for a syrup was made of sugar and of watchfulness in about equal measure, and a pot left to itself would boil over or catch and burn in the time it took to cross the room. So the master drew his stool near the hearth and settled to the tending of it, and the sweet heavy steam rose about him, and the light of the low flame lay warm upon his hands, and for a while the whole shop smelled of nothing but boiling sugar and the herb or the fruit that flavored it. A syrup was at heart a way of catching the virtue of a plant and keeping it sweet and sound for a year or more. An infusion or a decoction of the herb was made first, drawing its goodness into water, and then sugar was dissolved into that liquid, and the whole boiled gently down until it thickened into a syrup that would keep where the plain watery draught would have spoiled in days. The sugar did two things at once, and both were prized. It preserved the medicine, holding off the rot that spoiled a wet thing left standing, and it hid the bitterness of the drug beneath its sweetness, which mattered more than a modern ear might think, for a great many patients, and nearly all children, would take gladly in a sweet syrup what they would have fought and spat out as a bitter tea. The skimming was the heart of the work, and the reason the pot could not be left. As the syrup heated, a pale scum rose slowly to its surface. The impurities of the sugar and the fine matter of the herb gathered together and floated up, and this had to be lifted off patiently with a flat skimmer again and again until the surface came clear and bright. A syrup well skimmed was clear and jewel-like and kept for a long time. One skimmed carelessly stayed cloudy and turned the sooner. So the master sat and skimmed, drawing the flat spoon across the surface each time the scum gathered, tapping it clean at the pot's edge, and watching, always watching, the slow rise and fall of the sweet liquid over the flame. Knowing when a syrup was done was a matter of judgment earned over many years, for there were no clocks fine enough and no measures sure enough to tell it, only the master's eye and hand. He watched how the syrup fell from the lifted spoon, whether it ran off thin and watery, or dropped slow and heavy and clung. He watched the size and the sound of the bubbles, which changed as the water boiled away and the sugar grew thick. The old book spoke of boiling a syrup to a thread, meaning that a drop pressed and drawn between finger and thumb would pull out into a fine thread before it broke, and this and a handful of other homely tests told the master the moment to lift the pot from the fire, neither too soon, while it was still thin and would not keep, nor too late, when it would harden past pouring as it cooled. The syrups themselves were many, and each had its long-loved use. There was the syrup of red roses, gentle and cooling, given for many small troubles and beloved for its color and its scent. There was the syrup of violets, prized as much for its beauty as its virtue, a soft blue that the old cooks and apothecaries used to test whether a thing was sharp or sweet, for it changed its color to tell them. There was the syrup of poppy heads for pain and for sleeplessness, given with a careful hand. There were the coughing syrups, thick with the herbs a wet winter called for, and the syrups of fruits, of quince and of barberry, and of the sharp hedgerow berries, medicine and delicacy at once. A well-stocked shop kept a dozen or more, ranked in their tall, wasted jars, and made them fresh as the season and the stores allowed. Close kin to the syrups were the conserves, and the master often had one of these in hand of an evening too. A conserve was made not by boiling, but by beating fresh flowers or herbs together with sugar, until the two became one soft sweet paste that kept the virtue of the plant in something very near its living state. The conserve of red roses was the most famous of all, a standard of nearly every shop, made by pounding fresh rose petals, with 3 or 4 times their weight of sugar, into a fragrant paste taken by the spoonful for a great range of complaints. Where the syrup caught a plant's virtue in a clear sweet liquid, the conserve caught it in a thick sweet solid, and between them they let the goodness of a summer's flowering be carried, sweet and sound, right through the barren depth of winter. Then there were the electuaries, thicker still, the medicines made by working powders of drugs into honey or into a heavy syrup, until they formed a soft mass that a spoon stood upright in, or that could be rolled between the hands into pills. These were the workhorses of the sweet cupboard, a way of giving a bitter or a bulky powder in a form that went down easily, and the grandest of them, the great compounded electuaries with their long lists of ingredients, were among the most valued medicines the shop possessed. Beside them the master made his lozenges, and his little troches, sweet drops of medicine dried hard to be sucked slowly, and his candied roots and stems, angelica and the sea holly and the rest, sugared and dried into a sweetmeat that was half medicine and half treat. Behind all of this stood sugar itself, and it is worth remembering how differently the apothecary saw it than a later age would. In the earlier centuries, sugar was no common thing, but a costly import, sold by the apothecary himself as a kind of spice or drug, kept with the pepper and the cinnamon and weighed out with care. It was held to be nourishing and gently healing in its own right, good for the chest and the lungs, a comfort to the weak, and so its use in medicine was no mere trick to sweeten a bitter dose, but a joining of two virtues, the sugars and the herbs, into one. Honey, older and cheaper, and always to hand, served the same double purpose in the plainer remedies, healing in itself and sweet enough to carry a bitter drug, and the oldest of all the sweet medicines, the oxymels and the honeyed waters, leaned wholly upon it. A syrup once made and jarred would keep, if it were boiled rightly and sealed close, for a year and often more, and this keeping was the whole quiet point of the labor. The fresh juice of a summer fruit, or the infusion of a spring flower would spoil within days left to itself, but caught in sugar, and boiled to the right thickness. It held its virtue sound through the whole turning of the year, so that a cough in the dead of winter might be met with the trapped sweetness of a rose that had bloomed in June. In this the syrup was of a piece with the conserve, and the dried herb, and the sealed tincture, all of them ways of holding a fleeting green virtue against the time it would be needed, and the shelf of full bright syrup jars was, in its way, a whole summer quietly preserved. There was a deep comfort in this corner of the trade, and the master felt it as he sat at the pot. The sweet warm smell, the low steady fire, the slow bright rise of the syrup, the skimming that asked just enough of his attention to still his thoughts and no more, all of it made the syrup hour one of the gentlest of the evening. It was work a tired man could do gladly, and work whose fruits were plainly good. A clear, sweet medicine that a sick child would take without a struggle and be the better for. When the syrup at last ran heavy from his spoon and clung as it should, he lifted the pot from the fire and set it by to cool, and knew that in the morning there would be one more full bright jar upon the shelf, and one more small comfort ready for whoever should come needing it. With the syrup off the fire and the sweet work done for the night, the master rose and stretched his back, and turned toward the low door at the rear of the shop, beyond which stood the still, whose slow dripping had gone on all through the evening's other tasks, unwatched but not forgotten. Let us turn now to the back room, and to the quiet and patient magic of the still. The back room was darker than the shop and warmer, and it held at its center the strangest and most wonderful of all the apothecary's engines, the still. To a stranger it might have looked like something from a dream, a great rounded belly of copper or of glass set over a gentle heat, and above it a curved head like a helmet, and from the head a long slender beak that ran down and down into a waiting vessel, and from the end of the beak, slow as thought, a clear drop gathering, swelling and falling, and then another, all through the quiet hours. This was distillation, the drawing of a thing's finest and most fleeting virtue up into vapor and down again into a pure, clear water. And it was the nearest the honest trade ever came to what looked like magic. The parts of the still each had their name and their long history. The lower vessel, the body that held the herbs and the water, the trade called the cucurbit, after the gourdet was shaped like. The curved head set upon it was the alembic proper, though in time the whole engine took that name, and the country tongue softened it further to the limbec. From the alembic ran the beak or the nose, down which the cooled vapor, turned back to liquid, made its slow way into the receiver at the foot of it all. In the finer stills a long coiled pipe, the worm, ran the vapor through a barrel of cold water to cool it the faster and catch more of it, and the drip from such a still ran quicker and fuller than from the plain kind. The heat beneath it was a matter of the greatest care, for distillation was a gentle art, and a fierce fire was its enemy. The most delicate waters, the fragrant flower waters whose whole worth lay in their scent, were not set over a naked flame at all, but drawn in a bath of warm water. The cucurbit, standing in a vessel of water, kept barely simmering, so that the herbs within felt only the mild and even heat that the water passed to them, and never the harsh scorch of the fire. This gentle bath the trade called the bath of Mary, after a distiller of the ancient world, remembered as the mother of the art, and its very name, handed down across more than 1,000 years, told how old and how honored this quiet work was. For coarser distilling a bath of hot sand served, and for the strong waters a steadier fire. But always the rule held that too much heat spoiled the work, and burnt the very virtue one meant to save. What the still made was a family of clear waters and strong spirits, each with its long-loved use. The commonest and best beloved was rose water, drawn from the petals of the rose in such quantity that a great shop might distill it by the gallon. A fragrant water used to bathe sore eyes, to cool a hot brow, to sweeten a sick room, and to flavor 100 medicines and dishes besides. There were the waters of other flowers and herbs, of elder and of lavender, of fennel for the eyes, and of plantain for wounds, each a gentle carrier of its plant's particular gift. And there were the strong waters, the aqua vita and its grander cousins, the cordial waters compounded of many spices and herbs distilled together, given in small warming doses to revive the faint and comfort the cold, medicines that a shop was proud to make well, and that kept sealed for years. The drip itself set the pace of the whole business, and there was no hurrying it. A still, once charged and lit, and brought to its gentle heat, gave up its water drop by patient drop across many hours, and the distiller's task was less to labor than to watch, to keep the heat even, to see that the receiver did not overflow, to change the vessel when one water was fully come over and another was to be caught, and above all to know when the good part was done and the coarse and useless part beginning. For the first water to come over was often the finest, and the last the least. And a wise distiller stopped his work before the dregs could taint what he had already won. Much of this watching fell to the quiet hours, and a still was often left running gently on through part of the evening, tended between the master's other tasks, its slow drip a soft and steady presence under everything else. The whole art had come to the apothecary down a long and curious road, and he half knew it as he tended his engine. Distillation had been the great labor of the alchemists, those searchers who had spent lifetimes heating and cooling and drawing off, seeking to purify metals and to draw the hidden essences out of all things, and even to find, some of them, the water of life that might cure every ill and hold off death itself. The apothecary sought no such marvels. He wanted only good rose water and sound aqua vita. Yet the engine he used, and the very idea behind it, that a thing had a finer inner virtue which patient heat could set free and gather pure, had come to him from those older dreamers, and the strong new spirituous medicines that were coming into the trade in the later centuries owed much to a bold physician who taught that the whole art of healing might be remade upon exactly this principle. Fire and strong spirit together made the still room the one corner of the whole shop a careful master never left quite easy in his mind. The aqua vita it made took a flame as readily as the spirit of wine on the shelves, and a still cracked or overheated, or a receiver spilled near the fire, could turn a night's gentle work into a swift disaster. So the still stood in its own room of stone or plaster, where it could do the least harm, watched the more closely for the danger in it, its fire the most carefully tended of any in the house. The very wonder of the thing carried its warning within it, and the trade respected both together, the marvel of the clear water gathering drop by drop, and the quick bright peril of the spirit that made it possible. The finished waters had to be kept as carefully as they were made, for a distilled water, clear and pure though it looked, could spoil in time if it were carelessly stored. The best were bottled close and kept cool and dark, and the finer flower waters were used within the year, while their scent was still true, for an old rose water that had lost its fragrance had lost the better part of its worth. The master bottled and stoppered, and labelled each water as it came off the still, dated where he was careful, and set it among its fellows upon the water shelf, and knew the age of every bottle there, as he knew the age of everything else in his keeping. There was a beauty to the still room at night that the master had never quite stopped feeling, however many thousand times he had sat with it. The low red glow of the gentle fire, the soft sound of the water simmering in its bath, the faint fragrance of whatever was distilling, roses most sweetly of all, filling the small warm room, and above it, the slow bright bead at the end of the beak, catching the firelight as it swelled and fell, each drop a small pure distillate of a whole summer's flowering, gathered patiently into the waiting glass. A man could sit with such a thing for an hour, and feel the whole hurry of the world fall away from him, and more than one apothecary asked what he loved best in his trade, named quietly the tending of the still by night. Tonight the still held rose water, near the end of its running, and the master looked into the receiver and saw it well filled with the clear fragrant water, and judged that the good of it was very nearly all come over. He drew the fire down a little further under it, to let the last of the fine water finish gently, and to stop it well before the coarse dregs could follow, and he set a clean stopper ready for the receiver against the moment it should be done. There was no hurrying this last of it, and no need. The still would finish in its own time, and he would come back to it once more before the night was out. And until then it could be left to its slow and faithful work, dripping softly on in the warm dark of the little room. With the still drawn down and tending itself for a while, the master went back through the low door into the shop, where a different kind of care was waiting, one that asked not for patience across hours, but for exactness in a single careful minute. For a physician's order lay upon the counter, left in the day to be made up ready against the morning, and the making up of it would need the finest and most trusted of all the shop's tools. Let us turn now to the scales, and to the grave and delicate art of weighing. The little brass scales stood on the counter, and beside them, in a small fitted box, lay the nest of weights, and these together were, in their quiet way, the conscience of the whole trade. Everything else in the shop might be judged by eye and by long habit, the fineness of a powder, the thickness of a syrup, the color of a tincture, but the quantity of a drug in a medicine could not be guessed. It had to be known exactly, and the scales were how it was known. A medicine was a matter of proportion above all, and a proportion is only as true as the weighing that makes it. And so the small, bright balance on the counter carried a weight of responsibility far out of keeping with its delicate size. The weights themselves ran down through a system as old and as careful as the trade, and every apprentice learned it until it was second nature. The smallest was the grain, once reckoned against the weight of a single grain of barley or of wheat, so small a thing that a breath could disturb it. 20 grains made a scruple, 3 scruples a drachm, 8 drachms an ounce, and 12 of those ounces the apothecary's pound. Each had its own little sign, a private shorthand that ran through every recipe and every jar, and a man who knew the signs could read a physician's order as plainly as a sentence, while a stranger saw only a row of curious marks. The tiny weights nested one within another in their box, from the heavy ounce down to the little leaves of brass that stood for the single grains, and the master handled the smallest of them with a pair of fine tweezers, for the warmth and moisture of a fingertip was enough to make a grain weigh false. The physician's order that lay on the counter was written in the physician's own hand, and reading it was itself a small art. It began, as all such orders did, with the old word that meant simply take, and then it listed the drugs, each with its sign and its weight. This so many drachms, that so many scruples, of each of these a like amount, and it ended with the direction of what to make of them all. A powder, a bolus, a draught, so many doses, and how they were to be given. The apothecary read it through once wholly before he touched a single jar, as a careful builder reads a plan before he lays a stone, making sure he understood every mark of it, and where a physician's hand was crabbed or a sign unclear, he would puzzle it out with real care. For a guess in the reading of an order could be as dangerous as a false weight in the making of it. Then the weighing began, and the master gave himself over to it wholly, for it asked his whole attention. He set the little weight in one pan and tapped the drug into the other, a very little at a time, until the beam swung level and hung true. And then he stopped, exactly there, neither a grain over nor a grain under. He weighed away from the fire and away from the door, for a draught could set the light pans swinging and spoil the reading, and he weighed by a steady candle set, where its light fell clean on the beam. Ingredient by ingredient the medicine was built up, each weighed as carefully as the last, the costly and the common alike, for the cheapness of a thing was no reason to weigh it loosely, when its proportion in the whole was what mattered. The gravity of all this care lay in a simple and sobering truth, which the master had known since he was a boy and never once forgot. The line between a medicine and a poison was very often only a matter of quantity. The same drug that healed in a scripple might harm in a drachm and kill in an ounce, and nothing stood between the sick and that danger but the honesty of the physician who wrote the order and the exactness of the apothecary who filled it. A slip of the weight, a misread sign, a moment's carelessness with a strong drug, and a medicine meant to mend became a thing that could do terrible harm. This was why the trade hedged its weighing about with so much discipline, and why the scales were kept so fine and cleaned so carefully, and why a good master weighed the gravest medicines twice over, checking his own work as though another's life hung upon it, because it did. When each thing had been weighed, the making up followed, and it too was done with care. The powders were mixed together on a clean sheet or in the small mortar kept for the purpose, worked until they were one even blend with no streak of any single drug left standing apart. A powder to be given in single doses was divided out into equal parts, each folded into its own little twist of paper, so many even papers in a row that the patient or the nurse need only take one at the appointed hour and not measure anything at all. A medicine to be a draught was mixed and bottled. A mass to be pills was rolled and cut and rounded, and each finished thing was wrapped, and labelled with its direction in a plain, clear hand, and set aside in a safe place against the morning, when the physician's servant would call for it, or the patient's own would come. The weights had their partners in the measures of liquid, and these too the trade kept exact, the small graduated glasses and the marked vessels by which a syrup or a water or a spirit was portioned out. A medicine was often a marriage of the weighed and the measured, so many grains of a powder stirred into so many spoonfuls of a water, and the master kept his measures as true as his weights, and cleaned them as carefully, so that the whole proportion of a remedy, its solids and its liquids alike, came out exactly as the physician had meant it. A shop's weights and measures were sometimes checked against the town's own standards, kept at the guild or the hall, so that a drachm in one shop should be a drachm in every other, and the sick be dealt with justly wherever they went. There was a deep, quiet satisfaction in this exact work, different from the sweet ease of the syrups, or the patient faith of the tinctures. It was the satisfaction of a thing done precisely right, of a difficult order read true and filled true, of a proportion held exactly as it was meant to be held. The master set the finished medicine on its shelf, and made a note of it in his book, and cleaned the scales, and settled the little weights back into their nest, each in its own hollow, and closed the box upon them. The gravest and finest work of the evening was done, and done well. And somewhere a sick person he might never see would be the better in the morning for the steadiness of his hand tonight. The smallest weights of all were a wonder in themselves, thin leaves and wires of brass so light that a breath would carry them off the pan, and the master kept them in their own small covered box, and lifted them only with fine tweezers, never with a finger, for the warmth and the damp of a fingertip was weight enough to make a grain read false, to weigh a single grain truly. In a shop where a draught stirred and a candle guttered was a small feat of patience every time, and yet the gravest medicines turned upon exactly such tiny amounts. And so the master gave the least weighings the same unhurried steadiness. He gave the greatest, knowing that in this work there was no such thing as a quantity too small to matter. Yet not everything the scales weighed could be left lying open on a shelf, and the order he had just made up had called for one thing that lived, always, behind a lock. So before he moved on, the master took up his candle and the small key that hung apart from his others, and turned toward the cupboard at the dark end of the shop that held the drugs a man did not leave within any careless reach. Let us turn now to the locked cupboard, and to the grave and quiet trust of the dangerous simples. The cupboard at the dark end of the shop was plainer than the bright ranks of jars. A stout wooden press with a good lock, and it held the drugs that no apothecary left within any careless reach. These were the dangerous simples, the strong and the deadly, the ones that healed only in the smallest and most carefully weighed amounts and harmed, or worse, in any amount above. A master kept the one key to this cupboard about his own person, apart from his other keys, and opened it himself when a strong drug was needed, and locked it again the moment the drug was weighed out. And the whole quiet care he took over it was one of the truest signs of what kind of man he was. Within stood the great sleepers and easers of pain, chief among them the opium, the dried tears of the poppy, the strongest friend and the most dangerous the trade possessed. In a right and tiny dose it stilled pain no other medicine could touch, quieted a racking cough, and brought sleep to those whom nothing else would let rest. And for these gifts it was prized above almost any drug in the shop. In too large a dose it brought a sleep from which there was no waking, and the whole distance between the blessing and the danger was a matter of a few grains, so that the weighing of it was done with the very finest of the scales and the very steadiest of hands, and never ever in haste. Beside the opium stood its darker kindred, the drugs the old herbals treated with plain fear and plain respect. There was the mandrake, whose forked root the country people half believed to be alive, and the henbane, and the deadly nightshade, and the hemlock, and the blue, hooded monkshood that was reckoned among the surest poisons that grew. There were the mineral things too, the quicksilver and the biting salts made from it, and the white arsenic, kept in their own stoppered vessels, and handled with a care beyond even the herbs. Each of these had its use in the healing art, in the right hand and the right amount, and each could kill a strong man with a very little, and the cupboard held them together in the dark, locked away from every accident. What made this cupboard so grave a trust was exactly that its contents faced two ways at once. The same soporific herbs that could poison were, carefully compounded, among the kindest medicines the trade knew, and the old surgeons had made from them a marvel called the sleeping sponge, a sponge steeped in a decoction of poppy, and henbane and mandrake and dried, then damped and held beneath the nose of a patient who must be cut, so that he sank into a deep sleep and felt less or nothing of what was done to him. It was a delicate and dangerous thing, easily made too strong, and the old books that give its receipt give also their warnings alongside, and it stands as a plain proof of the cupboard's whole double nature, that the very drugs a man locked away for their danger were the same ones that could spare a sufferer the worst hour of his life. The law and the guild alike hedged the selling of these drugs about with rules, and a careful master kept them scrupulously. He did not sell a strong poison to a stranger, nor to a child, nor to anyone whose purpose in wanting it he did not trust. He knew his customers, and when a dangerous drug was sold he often noted it, who had it and how much and for what, so that if any harm came of it the record might speak. The trade lived always under a certain shadow in this, for where there are drugs that heal in small doses, there are drugs that kill in large ones, and an apothecary was, of necessity, the keeper of the means of poisoning as well as of healing. He answered that shadow with carefulness, with the lock, with the record, with the plain refusal to sell where he doubted, and with a conscience that took the danger of his own stock as seriously as its good. There was a particular stillness to the master's manner whenever he stood at this cupboard, a gravity a watcher would have noticed at once. He did not chatter over it, as he might over the syrups, nor handle its contents with the easy familiarity he showed the common jars. He unlocked it, took what the order called for, weighed it with doubled care, checking the sign against the physician's hand and the weight against the beam, and locked the cupboard again before he did anything else, so that it was never left open and untended for a moment. The gravest medicines demanded the gravest attention, and the whole trade understood that a moment's carelessness here outweighed 100 small carelessnesses anywhere else in the shop. The very vessels that held these drugs were often marked apart from the rest, so that no hand could ever reach one by mistake in a moment of hurry. Where the common jars wore their names in plain fair lettering, the dangerous ones might be set in dark glass, or given a vessel of a different make, or marked with some plain sign that every soul in the shop was taught to read as a warning. In this way even the pots themselves spoke, telling the reaching hand to pause and be certain, and a well-ordered poison cupboard was as legible in its dangers as the open shelves were in their common cures, so that carefulness was built into the very furniture of the thing. Not all the cupboard's drugs were the great sleepers and the mineral poisons. Some were the fierce purges, the drugs that worked upon the body with a violence that could heal in a small and careful dose and harm badly in a larger one. The griping roots and the drastic resins that the old physic leaned upon far more than a later age would think wise. These too lived behind the lock, for they were strong enough to do real harm in unskilled hands, and they were weighed with the same doubled care as the sleepers. A scruple where the order said a scruple, and never a grain beyond. The whole cupboard, sleepers and poisons and purges together, was a gathering of the trade's most powerful and most double-edged tools, kept apart, not because they were evil, but because they were strong. Tonight the cupboard had been opened once already, for the order he had just weighed had called for a small measure of one of its gentler sleepers, and he opened it now, only to be sure it was as it should be. The vessels all stoppered and standing in their right places, nothing spilled, nothing amiss. He counted them with his eye, as a shepherd counts, and found the count true, and drew back a step, and turned the key, and hung it once more apart from his others. The dangerous drugs were safe in the dark, doing no harm, waiting for the careful hand and the exact need that alone would ever bring them out again. It was, in its way, the most responsible minute of his whole evening, and he gave it the weight it asked, and no more, and moved on. There was a plain and steadying wisdom in how the trade held all this, and it is worth taking from the cupboard as we leave it. The dangerous things were not feared into disuse, nor treated as evil in themselves, for the trade knew that the poppy that could kill could also spare a dying man his pain, and that the choice between harm and help lay not in the drug, but in the knowledge and the care of the hand that used it. This was the whole creed of the apothecary in small. That knowledge and care together could turn even the deadliest gift of the green world to mercy, and that the answer to a dangerous thing was never fear, but understanding, kept behind a good lock and used with a steady heart. With the cupboard locked, and the gravest work of the evening behind him, the master turned to something altogether gentler and warmer and kinder to the hands, the tending of the salves and the plasters that so much of his daily trade relied upon. Let us turn now to the salve pot, and to the soft, slow work of the ointments. The salve pot was set at the edge of the low fire, where a mild and steady warmth would keep its contents soft without ever letting them grow too hot. And the master drew it a little nearer, and began the pleasant task of topping up the gallipots of ointment that the day's trade had drawn down. Of all the medicines the shop made, the ointments were perhaps the most homely and the most constantly wanted, for they answered the endless small hurts of ordinary life, the cuts and the burns, the chapped and cracked hands of winter, the sore places and the stiff joints and the rashes that no household was ever long without. A shop might sell a grand cordial once in a season, but it sold its green salve and its wound ointment week in and week out, all the year round. An ointment was made, at its simplest, by working the virtue of a herb into a soft, fatty base that would carry it and hold it against the skin. The base was some clean fat or oil, lard rendered pure, or mutton suet, or sweet oil, often stiffened with a little beeswax to give it body, and into this the herbs were worked, either their oils drawn out by gentle heat and then strained free of the spent leaf, or their fine powders stirred in, until the whole was a smooth green or golden salve that a spoon could lift and the skin could take. The green ointments smelled of the herbs that filled them, and the wound salves of the resins and the healing gums, and the whole corner of the shop where they were kept had a soft, waxy, herbal smell quite different from the sweet reek of the syrups or the sharp bite of the tinctures. The making of them was a matter of gentle heat and patient stirring, and it suited the quiet of the evening well. The fats and the oils were warmed until they ran clear, and the herbs steeped in them until their color and their virtue had passed into the fat, and then the whole was strained through a cloth to leave the spent green matter behind, and stirred as it cooled so that it set smooth, and even rather than parting into hard fat and thin oil. Too fierce a heat browned the fat and spoiled the salve. Too little stirring as it cooled left it coarse and separated. So the master warmed and stirred with a light and watchful hand, and the salve thickened slowly under his spoon toward exactly the softness he wanted, firm enough to keep, soft enough to spread. The plasters were kin to the ointments but stiffer and stronger, and they were made for a different kind of use. Where an ointment was rubbed lightly on, a plaster was spread thick upon a piece of cloth or soft leather and laid over the trouble, a sore joint, an aching back, a wound to be drawn or held, and left there to do its slow work over hours or days. The plaster mass itself was a stiff blend of oils and waxes and resins, sometimes of litharge cooked long with oil into a smooth grey body, and it was hard when cold and softened with warmth, so that it was melted a little at the fire and spread while soft and pressed on, while still warm enough to cling. The trade rolled its plaster masses into long sticks for keeping, and cut and warmed and spread from them as each need arose. Spreading a plaster well was a small skill of its own, and the apprentice practiced it long before he was let loose on a customer's cloth. The warmed mass had to be laid on evenly, neither too thin to hold nor so thick it oozed at the edges, and spread out to the right size and shape for the part it was meant to cover, with a clean margin of cloth all round. A heated flat iron or a broad spatula was drawn across it to smooth it, and to keep it soft as it was worked, and a well-spread plaster came off the counter neat and even and ready to lay on warm. It was humble work and constant, and a busy shop went through a great deal of it, for a plaster once used was done, and every fresh trouble asked a fresh one. Between the soft ointment and the stiff plaster lay a middle kind, the cerate, named for the wax that gave it its body, firmer than a salve and softer than a plaster, spread thick and kept in place over a trouble that wanted steady warmth and a gentle pressure both. And there were the cloths themselves to think of. The linen and the soft, dressed leather a plaster was spread upon, cut to the part they were meant for, a small square for a finger, a broad band for an aching back, kept ready in a drawer against the day's needs. The apothecary's outward remedies were as much a matter of cloth and fitting as of the medicine spread upon them, and a plaster well cut and well shaped to its place did its work far better than one laid on carelessly, however good the drug within it. There was a whole ladder of these outward remedies, from the lightest to the strongest, and a good apothecary knew every rung of it. There were the simple, soothing salves for chapped skin, and the cooling ones for burns and hot inflammations, and the drawing ones meant to bring a swelling to a head, and the healing wound salves rich with resin and honey, and the warming rubs for cold aching joints, and the stiff strong plasters for the deepest and most stubborn troubles. Each had its herbs, its base, its making, and its use, and the shelves and gallipots that held them made up one of the busiest and most useful quarters of the whole shop, the plain daily medicine of a working world that was forever cutting and burning and straining itself. Behind many of the finest ointments lay an infused oil, made in its own season and kept ready for the salve, making of the whole year. A quantity of flowers or herbs was laid in sweet oil and set in the summer sun for weeks, until the oil had drawn out the plant's color and virtue and taken on its very hue, the oil of roses a pale gold, the red oil of the wound herb a deep and startling crimson that seemed to hold the summer light within it. These oils were the shop's stored sunshine, the warmth of past months waiting in a jar, and an evening's salve. Making often began by reaching for one of them and warming it gently into the base, so that a winter ointment might carry the virtue of a flower long since faded from the fields. An ointment, being made of fat, did not keep as long as a dried herb or a sealed tincture, and the master watched his salves for the day when the fat in them turned and grew rank, for a rancid ointment was no fit thing to lay upon a wound however good its herbs had been. So the salves were made in modest amounts and used while fresh, the pots refilled often rather than filled once and left, and this was part of why the topping of the gallipots was an evening task come back to again and again, rather than a thing done once for a season. The plainest wisdom of the salve corner was simply this, that a small pot of good fresh ointment served better than a great pot gone stale, and the master made and refilled accordingly. As he topped the last gallipot and smoothed its surface and set its lid in place, the master felt again the quiet satisfaction of the useful trade, for there was nothing grand in a pot of green salve, and yet there was a great deal of good in it. The sure and gentle answer to 100 small sufferings that would walk through his door in the season to come. The ointments were done, soft and sweet, smelling in their pots, the plaster masses rolled and put by, the salve pot drawn back from the fire and covered, and with the outward remedies tended. The master's thoughts turned, as they often did toward the middle of the evening, to the greatest and most laborious medicine of the whole trade, the one that stood in the place of honor and took not an evening, but many weeks to make. Let us turn now to the great compounds, and to the long and almost ceremonial making of theriac. In the place of honor among all the shop's medicines, in its great and beautiful jar, stood the theriac, and no account of an apothecary's evening would be whole without a quiet turning toward it, for it was the grandest and the most ancient thing the trade knew how to make. The country tongue had worn its long name down to treacle, so that a word which now means only a sweetness once meant the king of all medicines, the great compound of many dozens of ingredients that was held, for the better part of 2,000 years, to be the surest guard against poison and plague that the art of healing possessed. The master's own jar of it was the finest object on his shelves, and he could no more have passed it of an evening without a thought than a churchman could pass his altar. Its story reached back into the deep past, and every apothecary knew at least the shape of it. It was said to have grown from the fear of poison in the courts of ancient kings, and one king above all, who so dreaded being poisoned that he was said to have taken a little of every poison daily, mixed with their antidotes, until his own body was proof against them all. The medicine that bore his name came down from that dark beginning, and a physician of imperial Rome was remembered for perfecting it, adding to it, of all things, the flesh of the viper, on the old reasoning that the creature which carried poison must also carry something against it. Whether or not that reasoning held, the recipe it produced outlived the empire that made it and was still being compounded, almost unchanged, in the shops of a wholly different age. The making of it was a labor beyond any other in the trade, and no single evening could contain it. 70 ingredients and more went into it: the opium and the viper's flesh, the myrrh and the cinnamon, a whole spice chest and a whole herb garden of things besides, each prepared in its own way, and all at last worked together with a great quantity of honey into a dark and fragrant electuary. And even then it was not done, for the true theriac was not used fresh. It was sealed away and left to mature for months, for years, some said for as long as 12, mellowing and marrying in the dark like a great wine, until its many quarrelling parts had settled into one, and only then was it reckoned to have come into its full virtue. To keep such a thing maturing on the shelf was to keep a small fortune waiting patiently upon time, because it was so costly and so prized, and because a false theriac could be a deadly cheat. Its making was watched as no other medicines was. In the great cities that were famous for it, the compounding became almost a public ceremony. The many ingredients laid out openly, for all to see and for the physicians and the officers of the guild to inspect and approve before ever they were mixed, so that the whole town might be sure that nothing was left out and nothing false put in. Only under that careful, open eye were the ingredients at last committed to the honey, and the great vessel and the finished treacle that came from such a making carried the name of its city like a mark of trust, sought after and sold far beyond the walls that made it. What it was believed to cure was almost everything, and here the calm historian must simply report what the old books claimed, rather than what any modern eye would credit. Theriac was given against the bites of venomous beasts, and against every kind of poison, which was its oldest purpose. It was given against the plague, and taken as a guard in the plague seasons, by those who could afford it. It was given for fevers, for coughs, for weak digestions, for melancholy, for 100 troubles besides. A true cure, all in the old sense, reached for whenever a case was grave and no plainer remedy had answered. How much of its great reputation it deserved, no one now can say, and much of it was surely the honey and the opium doing kindly work, while the 60 other things did little. But the faith in it was real, and it lasted the better part of 2,000 years, which is longer than most of our certainties last. So great was the fame of the treacle, and so high its price, that it drew the counterfeiter as honey draws the fly, and a whole shadow trade grew up in false and feeble imitations, made with the cheap parts left out or the costly ones spared, sold to the trusting under the great name. This was the very reason the honest making was watched so openly, and the reason the treacle of a famous and well-governed city was worth so much more than an unknown one, for its civic mark was a promise that the thing was true. A careful buyer, a physician or a knowing householder, learned the signs of a good treacle, its color, its scent, the way it worked upon the tongue, and would pay well for the genuine article from a shop he trusted, rather than risk the cheat, and a master's own good name was, in the end, the surest warrant his theriac could carry. The theriac and the mithridate did not stand quite alone, for the old formularies held a whole small company of these grand confections, the great cordial electuaries and the spiced confections that were the treasures of the trade, each with its long list of costly parts and its own particular virtue. There was the confection famous for gladdening the heart and lifting the spirits of the melancholy, rich with gold and with gems in the grandest receipts. And there were the several lesser cordials that a shop made for those who could not reach to a full theriac. These were the medicines of the well-to-do and the desperate alike, reached for when a case was grave, and the making of them well was among the proudest skills a master owned, a sign that his shop stood among the first rank of its trade. The master kept his own store of it with a special care, and tonight, as often, he paused to tend it. He looked to the seal of the maturing vessel. The batch he had made up a good, while since and set by to mellow, and found it sound. He looked to the level of the finished treacle in its fine jar, and judged how long his store would last, and whether he must think of making more before the next plague. Season's fear sent half the town to his counter for it. He turned nothing and hurried nothing, for the great medicine kept its own slow time and would not be rushed, but he gave it the attention its worth deserved, the way a man looks in of an evening upon the most valuable thing in his keeping, simply to be sure that all is well with it. Standing beside the theriac were its lesser brethren, the other great compounds the trade had inherited and still made. The mithridate that was its near twin and elder, and the several grand electuaries and confections that filled a page each in the old formularies with their long lists of costly parts. These too were the work of days and the pride of the shop, and these too the master tended in their turn, for a shop that could make the great compounds well stood high among its fellows, and a young master often labored for years before he dared attempt his first theriac, and remembered the making of it ever after as one of the proving works of his life. There was something in these ancient medicines that reached beyond their doubtful virtue and touched the master quietly whenever he stood among them, and it was this. In making his theriac by the old receipt, he was doing, almost gesture for gesture, what apothecaries had done in the same trade 1,000 years and more before him, weighing the same mirror, pounding the same spices, stirring in the same honey, waiting the same patient years. Few trades could say as much. The great compound jar on his shelf was a living thread run back through all that time, unbroken, hand to hand, master to apprentice, and to tend it of an evening was to hold, for a moment, the far end of a very long rope indeed. He let the thoughts settle and pass, and turned from the great medicines to a homelier question. The question of where all his herbs came from in the first place. Let us turn now to the drying loft above the shop, and to the long chain of hands that brought the green world in through the apothecary's door. For all the shop's engines and jars and compounds, everything in it began as a growing thing, and the getting of those growing things was a trade in itself, a long chain of hands reaching from the apothecary's counter back out into the hedgerows and gardens and far countries where his medicines first drew breath as leaf and root and bark. Of an evening, when a fresh supply had come in that day, the last of the master's making, work was often the sorting and the hanging of it, carrying the day's green harvest up the narrow stair to the drying loft beneath the roof, where it would hang and dry and become, in a few weeks, the sound-dried stock that filled his jars. The nearest source of all was the shop's own garden, the physic garden that a good apothecary kept behind or beside his premises, if he had the ground for it, a plot laid out in neat beds of the herbs he used most and could most easily grow. Here he raised his own mints and his own sage, his rue and his rosemary and his marigold, and a great deal besides. And a walk through it in the growing season let him gather what he needed at its freshest, cut in the morning and hanging in the loft by night. The garden was the apothecary's own small kingdom of green, and many a master loved it as dearly as his shop, and knew every plant in it by name, and by nature as another man knows his children. What the garden could not supply, the country people brought to the door. There were the herb women, who gathered from the wild hedgerows and the meadows, and carried their baskets of fresh green herbs into the town to sell, and the root diggers and bark strippers who supplied the harder materia that grew in wood and waste ground, and the country wives who raised a little surplus of some useful herb and brought it in for a few coins. These humble gatherers were the true foundation of the whole trade, for without their patient stooping in field and hedge no apothecary could have filled 1/10 of his jars, and a wise master kept fair and friendly terms with the ones who brought him good clean herbs in season, knowing his shop leaned upon them more than either quite said. Beyond the herb, women lay the wider world of the drug trade, and it reached very far indeed. The spices and the costly exotic drugs, the things that did not grow in any northern garden, came by the long roads and the longer sea, lanes from the far east and the south, and, in the later centuries, from the new world across the ocean. The rhubarb prized for the gut, carried overland from the far east at great cost, the aloes and the senna and the myrrh out of the hot southern lands, the strange new barks and roots that came back in the ships from the Americas. These reached the apothecary through the drug merchants and the great fairs, bought in bulk when the price was fair and laid up in the back stores, and their far origins were part of the wonder of the trade, the reason the dried crocodile hung over the counter, and the reason a small shop in a northern town could hold in its drawers the produce of half the world. There was a whole calendar of supply behind the shop's steady shelves, and the master carried it in his head the year round. The garden gave in its season and not before. The herb women came when their herbs were ripe and were gone when the season passed. The roots waited upon the autumn digging, the barks upon the spring rising of the sap, the imported spices upon the fairs and the ships that kept their own slow times. To have a full and balanced stock the year round, a master had to buy and gather and lay in against each thing's season, thinking always some months ahead of the day's need. And the quiet planning of this long calendar of supply was one of the unseen labors that lay behind every ordinary jar a customer took for granted across the counter. The drying loft itself was one of the quiet glories of the shop, and a stranger let up into it would not soon have forgotten it. Under the slope of the roof, from every beam and rafter, hung the herbs of the season in their tied bunches, heads down, drying slowly in the still warm air that rose from the shop below, and the whole loft was thick with their mingled fragrance, the sweetness and the sharpness and the green of 100 plants together. Here the fresh harvest lost its water and gained its keeping, for a herb well dried held its virtue for a year or more, where the same herb left green would have rotted in a week, and the drying was as much a part of the apothecary's craft as any grinding or distilling. There was a right way to dry a herb, and the master saw to it. The bunches were tied loosely, not crushed, and hung with air all round them, in shade and gentle warmth, rather than in the sun that would have burnt away their finer virtues, and turned or moved now and then so that all dried evenly, and none moulded in a damp fold. A herb dried too fast grew brittle and lost its scent. One dried too slowly, in air too still or too damp, spoiled before it ever dried at all. So the loft was kept airy and warm and watched, and the day's fresh bunches hung with care among the drying stock of the weeks before. And the master climbed down the narrow stair again, with his hands smelling of whatever he had last handled, green and good. The buying of the far, carried drugs was its own skill, and a master gave real thought to it. The great fairs that came round with the seasons brought the drug merchants and their bales, and a wise apothecary went to them with a careful eye and a good nose, for the exotic drugs were costly and easily cheated. The good rhubarb passed off with the poor, the fresh mixed with the stale, the whole adulterated with things that only looked the part. He bought where he trusted, and he bought in quantity when the price was fair and the quality sound, laying in a costly drug against a year or more of trade. For such things did not come every day to a northern town, and a shop caught short of them could not simply step out to the hedgerow for more. The dried stock, once made, had its own enemies in the store, and the loft and the back room were watched against them the year round. The damp could mold a hung bunch or cake a stored powder. The moth and the small boring weevil could work quietly through a chest of dried herb and leave it half dust before anyone thought to look. The mouse and the rat would make free with any seed or sweet thing left unguarded, which was the cat's whole reason for being kept. So the stores were held dry and aired, and looked into often. The old checked over for spoiling, the infested condemned before it could spread, and this watching over the stored harvest was as much a part of the trade as the gathering of it, for a herb was only as good as the keeping that brought it sound to the moment of its use. To stand a moment in that fragrant loft, among the slowly drying harvest of a whole countryside, was to feel the shop's deep roots in the living land all round it, and the master felt it now as he tied the last bunch and hung it, and turned to go down. Every jar on his shelves had begun here, or in a loft like this, as a green and growing thing, gathered by patient hands and hung to dry in the quiet dark. The whole grand edifice of the trade, the Latin names and the fine scales and the ancient compounds, rested at bottom upon the simple fact of plants that grew and people who gathered them, and a wise apothecary never quite forgot it. With the loft seen to, and the day's harvest hung, he came down the stair to the one part of the shop that held not its medicines but its memory, the shelf of books and the receipt book that carried the whole of its learning. Let us turn now to the receipt book and to the old herbals on the shelf. Not everything the shop knew was held in the master's memory or in his hands. A part of its learning lived in ink on the shelf of books that stood near the counter, and in the worn receipt book that was, in its quiet way, the most valuable thing in the whole place, worth more than the theriac and the spices together, for a shop's stock could be bought again, but its knowledge, once lost, was lost for good. Toward the middle or the end of a quiet evening the master often turned to these, to read a little, or to copy something down, or simply to see that the shop's memory was in as good an order as its shelves. The books on the shelf were the trade's inheritance from the wide world of learning, and some of them were very old indeed. Foremost among them, in one edition or another, stood the great work of the ancient Greek physician who had walked with the Roman armies gathering plants, and had set down, in 5 long books, the virtues of hundreds of herbs and minerals and animal medicines. That one work had been copied by hand, translated, and copied again for 1500 years. The foundation stone under the whole materia of the trade, and an apothecary who owned a good printed copy of it, owned a direct line back to the very beginnings of his craft. Beside it might stand the works of the other great ancient physician, whose teaching on the humours shaped how every remedy in the shop was understood, and whose name the trade still gave to a whole class of its preparations. Then there were the books of the Middle Ages, the formularies and antidotaries that had gathered up the recipes of the monasteries and the medical schools and set them in order. The books that told an apothecary exactly how the great compounds were to be made, ingredient by ingredient. These were the working handbooks of the trade for centuries, thumbed and stained in every shop, and a master knew his way about them as a priest knows his way about his breviary, turning without looking to the page that held the recipe he wanted. From such books the theriac and the mithridate and the grand electuaries were made, their long lists of parts set down, in an order the whole trade shared, so that the same medicine might be made alike in 100 distant shops. In the later centuries the printed herbals came, great and beautiful books with woodcut pictures of every plant, so that a man might match the herb in his hand against the image on the page and be sure of what he had. These were prized possessions, costly and much admired, and a customer waiting at the counter might be shown a picture in one to settle a question of which plant was meant. And later still came the official books, the pharmacopoeias drawn up by the colleges of physicians, which set down by authority exactly what every medicine sold in the shops must contain, so that a remedy asked for by name should be the same remedy whichever shop supplied it. These carried the force almost of law, and a careful apothecary kept the newest one to hand and compounded by it, that no inspector might ever fault his work. There was one printed book that came into the trade by a stranger road than the rest, and it is worth a quiet word. For a long age the official book of recipes had been kept in Latin, closed to all but the learned, and it was held by the physicians that this was right and proper, that the mysteries of medicine should not be scattered abroad among the common people. Then a bold man of the trade, in a time of great upheaval, put the whole of it into plain English and printed it cheap, so that any literate soul might read what had been the physician's guarded secret and know what went into the medicines they paid so dearly for. The learned were scandalized and said hard things of him, but his book went into edition after edition and never after left the people's hands. And it stands as a reminder that the knowledge on the apothecary's shelf did not always wish to stay behind the counter. Yet dearer to the master than any printed book, and never to be bought at any price, was the shop's own receipt book, the thick worn manuscript in which generations of its masters had set down the recipes they trusted, their own refinements, their small hard-won discoveries, the exact way this shop made its green salve or its cough syrup or its famous cordial. Much of it was common enough knowledge, but some of it was the shop's own, a receipt worked out by some long-dead master and handed down within these walls alone, the nearest thing the trade had to a secret worth keeping. To own such a book was to own the accumulated wisdom of every apothecary who had ever stood behind this counter, and the master handled it with a care he gave to nothing else on the shelf. The book had grown by slow accretion, like the shop itself. Each master in his turn had added to it a new remedy that had proved its worth, a note in the margin correcting an older receipt, a better way of preparing some difficult drug found out through years of trying. The hands changed down the pages, the ink and the spelling, and the very shape of the letters shifting from one generation to the next, so that to turn the book from front to back was to read the whole history of the shop written in its own medicines. A master adding a receipt of his own to it of an evening was doing a small solemn thing, setting his own hand into that long conversation, leaving something of his own knowledge for the masters who would come after him and never know his name. Copying was how the young learned, and much of an apprentice's book work was exactly this, the patient transcribing of receipts from the shop's book and the printed authorities into a book of his own, which he would carry away with him when his years were served, and which would be the foundation of his own shop's knowledge in time. There was a real virtue in the copying beyond the getting of the words, for a receipt written out slowly by one's own hand was learned far more deeply than one merely read, and a master often set his apprentice to copy exactly the recipes he most wanted the boy to know by heart. Of a quiet evening the boy might sit at the end of the counter with his own book and his careful hand, copying by the same candle that lit his master's reading, the knowledge passing down the generations one slow line at a time. All of this learning was in Latin, for the most part, the common tongue of medicine across the whole of Europe, and this was no small thing. It meant that the trade's knowledge was one knowledge from one end of the continent to the other, that a recipe set down in one country could be read and made in another, that the apprentice's hard-won Latin opened to him not merely his master's shelf, but the whole vast library of the healing art in every land. The Latin names on the jars, the Latin recipes in the books, the Latin the physician wrote his orders in, all of it bound the apothecary into a great community of learning that reached far beyond his own town and back through many centuries. And a boy grinding at his Latin grammar was, though he might not feel it, being handed a key to all of that. There was a deep quiet in the shop when the master sat with his books of an evening, and it was different from every other quiet of the night. The making quiet of the tinctures and the syrups was a quiet of the hands. This was a quiet of the mind. The master bent to the page in the ring of candlelight, reading the words of physicians, dead 1,000 years, or setting down a line of his own for physicians, not yet born. And the whole long, unbroken chain of the trade's knowledge present with him there at the counter, in the printed books and the worn manuscript and the apprentice's slowly filling copy alike. It was, perhaps, the most truly learned hour of his whole day, and one of the ones he valued most. When he had read what he wished, or copied what he meant to keep, the master closed the great books and set them square upon their shelf, and closed the shop's own receipt book last of all, and laid his hand upon it a moment, before he set it in its safe and accustomed place. The knowledge was safe for another night, gathered and ordered and handed on. The printed wisdom of the ages and the private wisdom of the shop together under one low roof. And with the books closed and the mind's work done, only the plainest tasks of the night remained, and the listening for whatever the dark hours might bring. Let us turn now to the night bell by the door, and to the shop that was never quite closed. Somewhere near the door hung the night bell, and though it rang only rarely, its quiet presence shaped the whole feeling of the apothecary's evenings, for it meant that the shop, even shut and dark, was never entirely closed. A physician kept his hours and a market its days, but sickness kept no hours at all, and a child that had been merely fretful at dusk might be truly ill by midnight, and a fever that was bearable in the daylight might turn frightening in the small hours when the whole house lay awake and afraid around it. For such moments the town needed somewhere to turn, and the apothecary's shop, with its one late window and its bell beside the door, was very often that somewhere. The bell, or in a plainer shop, only the knocker or the fist upon the shutter, was a standing promise, offered without ever being spoken, that a real need after dark would find an answer here. The master lived above or behind his shop, close enough to hear it, and though he did not sit up waiting, he never wholly laid the trade aside either. Even in sleep, some part of his mind kept a listening ear, the way a parent sleeps light while a child is ill, and a knock at the right hour would bring him down the stair with his candle before the caller had time to knock twice. Not every hour of the night was equal in this, and the master knew the shape of the risk. The first hours after closing, while he was still up and at his work, a call was easily answered, and hardly a trouble at all. The deep middle of the night was another matter, when a knock meant rising from a warm bed into the cold and the dark, and such calls were rarer, and, as a rule, graver, for people did not lightly rouse the apothecary at such an hour, and only true fear drove them to it. He judged much from the very hour of a knock, and more from the sound of it, the difference between an idle late caller and a hand hammering in real terror being plain to anyone who had heard both. There was an old kinship here with the healers of the villages, the wise women and the midwives, whose one lit candle in a cottage window had told a labouring mother that help was awake and waiting. The apothecary's late window, said the same thing to his town, and it meant the same comfort. A man walking home troubled in the dark, past the shut and shuttered shops, might see the one faint light still burning behind the apothecary's front, and take a quiet reassurance from it, the knowledge that if the worst came to his own house that night, there was a door he could knock at and a hand that would answer. That reassurance was worth something to a whole town, whether or not the bell ever rang. Suppose, then, that tonight it does ring, once, and let us follow the Master as he answers it, for it will show us the shape of the thing better than any telling. The knock comes not long after his own work is done, a quick anxious rapping at the shutter, and he is at the door with his candle almost at once. On the step stands a servant, out of breath from running, sent from a house up the hill where a child has been seized with a griping pain and a fever and cannot be quieted, and the mother, frightened, has sent for something to ease it, while another runs for the physician. The Master listens to the whole of it before he moves, asking 2 or 3 plain questions, to be sure he understands the trouble, for a remedy sent on a garbled message is worse than none. Then he works, quickly but without any haste that might breed a mistake. He knows the child, or knows the house, and knows the physician who will likely be called, and what that physician favors. And he weighs out a gentle, easing draught by the candle on his counter. The same careful weighing he would give it by day, no less exact for the hour. He folds the direction with it, how much to give, and how often, and to send again, if the child is no better by such an hour, and he presses it into the servant's hand with a word of steadiness. For half of what he sends up the hill tonight is the plain calm of a man who has seen 100 such nights and is not afraid. The servant runs off into the dark, and the Master bars the door again, and the shop settles back into its quiet, and that is the whole of it. Such calls were the truest test of what the trade was for, and a good apothecary answered them as a duty he had taken on with his craft, and would not shirk. He might be paid for the night's remedy, or he might not, and with a poor and frightened family, he often did not press it, entering the small sum in his book to be forgotten as easily as it was written. What he gave in the night was not really the draught at all, or not only. It was the fact of being there, awake and skilled and steady, at the hour when a household most needed exactly that, and it bound a town to its apothecary with a loyalty no daytime trade could buy. The plague years were the hard extreme of all this, when the night bell might ring again and again through a single dreadful season, and the apothecary's light burned late in his window night upon night, while the sickness moved through the streets around him. In such times he stood in real danger himself, for he could not tend the stricken and keep wholly clear of their contagion. And yet the trade's whole tradition held that he should stand his ground and keep his shop open when the physicians of means had fled to the country and the town most needed whatever help remained. Many did stand, and some paid for it with their lives, and the memory of those seasons ran deep in the trade, a sober pride in a duty kept when keeping it cost the most. The troubles that brought a caller after dark were of a particular kind, and the Master had met most of them across his years. A child seized in the night with a fever or a griping pain, a grown man struck down all at once and frightening his household, a woman in a hard labor, and the midwife sending for something to ease or to strengthen. a burn, or a deep cut from an accident by firelight. A dying person past all curing, whose people wanted only something to soften the last hard hours. These were the night's business, graver on the whole than the day's small trade, and the master kept ready in his mind, as much as upon his shelves, the plain first answers to each of them, so that a knock at any hour should never find him quite at a loss. Yet most nights, of course, the bell did not ring at all, and this too was part of its meaning. The master did his evening's work in the quiet expectation of an interruption that, on the great majority of nights, never came, and there was a peculiar peace in that, in being ready for a call and then being spared it. As the evening drew on toward its close and no knock had come, he began to let the day's readiness ease out of him, to trust that this night, at least, the town would keep well without him, and that he might soon take his candle up the stair and lay the whole trade down until morning. The unrung bell by the door was, in its silent way, a small nightly blessing, and he had learned across the years to be quietly grateful for it. He glanced toward it once more as he moved on, the plain bell on its bracket, still and silent in the candlelight, and left it to its watch. Whatever the night might yet bring, the shop was ready for it, provisioned and ordered and awake, and there was nothing more that readiness could do but wait. And so his thoughts drifted, as a tired man's will, away from this one particular evening and toward the great slow wheel of all his evenings, the way the same closing ritual changed its color and its work through the turning of the year. Let us turn now to the seasons and to the long round of the apothecary's year. For the evening we have watched, though it stood for all such evenings, was really only one turn of a wheel that never stopped turning, and the same shop, shut and tended by the same candlelight, wore a different face in every season of the year. The closing ritual scarcely changed, the shutters and the book, and the sweeping and the jars, and yet the work that filled the quiet hours shifted steadily with the months, following the green world's own slow round from first growth to bare winter and back again, so that no two seasons' evenings were ever quite the same. In the spring the shop woke along with the land. The first fresh green came in through the door after the long winter of dried stock, the early leaves and the first flowers, and the master's evenings filled again with the handling of living herbs, the sorting and hanging of the season's first small harvests. The garden behind the shop stirred and greened, the sap rose in the hedgerows, and the whole trade lifted a little with the lengthening light, glad after the dark months to have fresh material under its hands once more. The winter's stores, run low by the long cold, were watched carefully now to see them stretch until the new growth could replace them, and the first distillings of the tender spring herbs began. In the summer came the great gathering, and the shop's evenings were at their fullest and most fragrant. This was the season the whole year turned upon, when herb after herb came ripe for cutting, and the drying loft filled to its rafters, when the roses bloomed, and the still ran night after night, drawing off the precious rose water, when the long light evenings gave hours enough for all the making the abundant season demanded. The herb women came daily to the door with laden baskets. The garden gave more than it could hold, and the master and his apprentice worked late among more green material than the winter had let them see in months, laying in against the barren seasons to come. It was the busiest and, many an apothecary thought, the best time of the whole year. In the autumn the work went underground, for this was the season of roots and barks and the last of the fruits. The leaves and flowers were mostly gathered and dried by now, and the digging season came in. The roots lifted when the plant's strength had drawn down into them for the winter, the barks stripped, the berries and hips and haws, and the orchard fruits brought in for their syrups and conserves. The evenings shortened, and the first coughs of the wet season began to be heard across the counter, and the master turned to laying in the winter medicines, the chest syrups and the warming things, filling his shelves against the long sickly dark that every autumn promised. There was a gathering, in feeling to the whole season, of a year's harvest of medicine being safely stored. In the winter the shop drew wholly upon what the other seasons had laid by, and its evenings grew quiet and inward. Little came fresh through the door now, and the master worked from his dried stores and his made medicines, his jars and his syrups and his tinctures, the saved-up virtue of the vanished summer. The fire was more precious in these months, and more carefully tended, and the shop's warmth and light were a comfort against the dark outside. These were the heavy seasons for sickness, the fevers and the coughs, and the agues of the cold and the wet, and the shop was busy across its counter, by day even as its evening making fell quiet, spending down the stores that spring and summer would, in their turn, come round again to replenish. The sicknesses too kept their seasons, and the master's stores were laid in with an eye to them. The spring brought its agues and its low fevers as the year turned wet and warm together. The summer, for all its plenty, brought the fluxes and gripings of the belly that the heat encouraged, and the fevers that were thought to rise from standing water. The autumn brought the first coughs and rheums as the cold came on, and the winter brought the deep chest troubles, the aching joints, and the long low illnesses of the dark and the wet, and, in the worst years, the great sicknesses that swept through whole towns. A master who had kept his shop a decade could very nearly have told you the month by the troubles that came across his counter, and he stocked and made against each season's known complaints well before ever they arrived. The year had its marked days too, and the trade kept them along with everyone else. There was the midsummer eve when certain herbs were held to be at their fullest strength and were gathered by whole families out in the fields, and the spring and autumn feasts that fell near the great turns of the growing year, and the saints' days that a country people used, far more than any written calendar, to remember when a thing should be planted or gathered or laid in. The apothecary's own year ran along these same marks, the herb to be cut about one saint's day, the root to be dug near another, the fair where he bought his spices falling always in the same season, so that the wheel of his working life turned to the same old bells as the wheel of the fields around him. And the wheel turned not only through the single year, but through the long years of a life, and the master felt that too, standing among his jars of an evening. He had kept these same seasons now for more turns than he cared to count, had seen the drying loft fill and empty, and fill again through more summers and winters than the young apprentice had yet lived, and would, if he was spared, see it fill a good few times more before he handed the shop on. There was no sadness in the thought, only the deep settledness of a man who has found his place in a great and patient turning, and made his peace with it, content to be one more careful keeper of the shop through his own allotted round of seasons, as others had kept it before him, and others would keep it after. Even the smell of the shop changed with the year, and a blind man might near enough have named the season by the air of the place. In spring and summer it was green and fresh, full of the scent of new cut herbs and the roses on the still. In autumn it turned darker and sweeter, thick with the boiling of fruit syrups and the earthy smell of dug root. In winter it grew quieter and drier, the air of dried stores and warm spice, and a little wood smoke from the careful fire. The master had breathed these changing airs so many years that he no longer marked them, and yet they were there, the turning of the seasons written even in the very smell of the shop, one more slow and faithful sign of the great wheel coming round. And so the wheel came round, winter to spring to summer to autumn, and back to winter again, year upon year, each turn the same in its shape and different in its particulars, and the shop kept its faithful evening ritual through all of them. There was a deep steadiness in this for the master, a sense of standing at the still center of a great slow turning, and it was one of the quiet rewards of a long life in the trade to have watched the wheel come round so many times that its every spoke was familiar, and to know on any evening of any season exactly where in the great year he stood and what the quiet hours would ask of him. With that long round settled comfortably in his mind, he came at last to the final task of the night, the slow last walk about his shop before the fire was banked and the candle carried up the stair. Let us turn now, as our own evening nears its close, to the master's last round of the shelves. The making was done now, and the reckoning, and the reading, and there remained only the last slow round of the shop before the master could call the day truly ended. He took up his candle from the counter and began to walk the shelves one final time, not looking for anything in particular, but seeing everything, the way a shepherd walks once more round a folded flock at dusk, though he knows they are all safely in. This last round was the quietest task of the whole evening, and in its way the most contented, for it asked nothing of him but to see that all was well, and all this night was well. He passed along the great wall of jars, and the candlelight woke their painted colors one rank at a time, and let them fall dark again behind him as he moved on. The syrups in their tall wasted vessels filled and sealed, the conserves and electuaries in their squat wide pots, the specie jars of dried root and leaf and seed, each topped to its proper level, each sealed against the damp. The little drawers behind the counter, closed and full. His eye ran over them without effort, reading the shelves as easily in the moving candlelight as he read them by day, and finding nothing out of place, no jar low, no lid loose, no gap where something ought to stand. He looked in upon the slow work he had set going, to be sure it was safe to leave. The tinctures stood in their warm corner, sealed and shelved, some newly begun and some near ready, steeping quietly on through the night as they would steep for weeks to come. The syrup he had skimmed sat cooling by the hearth, thickening gently toward the morning's jar, and through the low door, in the little back room, the still had all but finished its running, its last fine drops gathered into the receiver, its fire drawn down to almost nothing, its clear, fragrant water safe and stoppered. Each of these could be trusted to see itself through the dark, and he left them to it, satisfied. He tried the locked cupboard once more in passing, a hand laid on it to feel that it held fast. The dangerous drugs safe in their dark, behind the good lock, and the key hung apart from his others. He saw the tools all cleaned, and in their places the mortar wiped, and the pestle resting in it, the scales dusted, and the little weights nested in their box, the salve pot covered, and the plaster masses rolled and put by. He saw the books square upon their shelf, and the shop's own receipt book in its safe place. Everything the day had used was clean again, and everything the shop possessed was in its accustomed spot, and the whole place stood ordered and provisioned and ready for whatever the morning or the night might ask of it. There was a great deal of quiet company in a shop at this hour, for the master was rarely truly alone in it. The jars had been filled by hands before his, and would be filled by hands after. The great mortar had rung under other masters. The receipt book carried the writing of men 50 and 100 years dead, and the very smell of the place, that deep layered sweetness, was the same smell it had held before he was born and would hold after he was gone. To walk the shelves of an evening was to walk among all of that, the long line of keepers of this one small shop, and a master who had grown old in the trade, felt them about him kindly at such an hour, not as ghosts but as company, fellow tenders of the same patient work. He thought, as he often did on this last round, of the boy asleep above him, and of the shop's own future. One day, if things went as they should, that tired apprentice would stand where the master stood now, candle in hand, walking these same shelves on his own, last round of some far-off evening, and the whole of what the master knew would live on in him, and in the receipt book the boy was slowly filling, and in the jars and the mortar, and the good lock and the drying loft. The shop would outlast the master as it had outlasted those before him, and there was a deep and settling comfort in that, in being not the owner of the thing so much as its keeper for a while, charged to hand it on in good order and content to do so. Now came the banking of the fire, the last and most careful act of the night, and the one the old curfew bell had first been rung for. The hearth could not be left burning freely through the unwatched hours, for that way lay the one disaster the whole street feared, and yet it could not be let go quite out either, for a dead hearth meant a cold and troublesome morning, the long labour of striking a new fire from flint and steel before any work could begin. So the master banked it, as households had banked their fires for 1,000 years, raking the glowing embers together into a close heap and covering them over with a blanket of ash, which held their heat safe and smothered through the night without any open flame, so that a stir and a breath in the morning would wake them again to life. It was a small nightly wisdom, the covering of the fire, and a shop full of oils and spirits and dry-hung herbs kept it with more care than most. With the fire banked safe, he made his last check of the ways into the shop, the great front shutter barred and pegged, the door bolted, the back room's outer door, if it had one, made fast, the window shutters closed and fastened. He went round them all by long habit, hardly needing the candle, feeling each bar and bolt home with a hand that had done it 10,000 times, and finding all secure. The shop was shut against the night now, as tight as a nut in its shell, warm and dark and safe, the one faint window, glow that had told the street help was awake soon to be the only light left, and that too, in a little while, to be carried up the stair and away. The cat had not stirred from its warm stone by the banked hearth, and would keep its own watch through the night over the seed drawers and the sugared conserves, as it had every night of its comfortable life. The apprentice had long since climbed to his corner above and fallen into the deep sleep of the young and the tired, done with the day's water and grinding and sweeping and copying, until the morning called him down to it all again. The whole small household of the shop was settling, one by one, into the dark, and only the master was still awake and moving, making the last round that only he could make, seeing the last things safe that only he would think to see. At last there was nothing left to do. He stood a moment in the middle of his shop with the single candle in his hand, and let his eye go once more, slowly, round the dim ranks of jars fading up into the shadows, the banked and glowing hearth, the cooling syrup, the cleaned and resting tools, the good lock, the closed books, the barred door, the whole ordered and provisioned and quietly breathing shop. It was a good place, and a good day's work was done in it, and a good night's slow work was set safely going, and there was nothing now that his staying up any longer could improve. The shop could keep itself till morning. It always had. So he took his candle, and turned, and went at last toward the stair, and the light moved with him, and left the shop behind it to the dark. The jars stood silent on their shelves, the tinctures steeped on in their warm corner. The last drops fell from the still, and were still. The banked fire glowed low and safe under its blanket of ash, and the cat curled closer to its warmth, and the whole shop, done at last with the long quiet business of its evening, settled fully and finally into the night. And there we may leave it, and let it rest, exactly as its master left it, and as he left it every night of his long and useful life. We have kept a long evening together, you and I, from the last customer of the day to the banking of the fire, and there is nothing left in it now that asks anything of either of us. The shop is shut and safe. The work is done. The night has come, and it is time now for you to do what the master and the boy and the cat have all done before you, and let the whole quiet weight of the evening settle you gently down into sleep. Let the shop stay with you a little as you go, if it likes, the warm layered sweetness of the air, the dim gold of the candlelight along the painted jars, the slow bright drop at the end of the still, the low glow of the banked fire under its soft grey ash. There is no need to hold on to any of it. Let the jars blur and the names fade, and the candlelight soften and go dim, and let the whole shop drift away from you into the dark, as easily as the master himself drifted up the stair and out of it. There is nothing left to remember and nothing left to do. Every jar is filled and sealed. Every tincture is steeping safely on. The fire is banked, the door is barred, the last candle is nearly out. Somewhere beyond the shutters the town has gone wholly still, and the long night lies ahead of you, unhurried, uninterrupted, entirely your own. And there is nowhere at all that you need to be, but exactly where you are. Let your breathing slow, and your thoughts grow dim, and every part of you soften and grow heavy, from your brow to your feet, sinking gently into wherever you are resting tonight. If your eyes close somewhere along the way through the shop, that was always the whole point of the evening, and there is nothing at all that you have missed. Sleep well. The Quiet Apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. Until then, there is only the low glow of the banked fire and the painted jars keeping their silent watch in the dark, and the long, soft, unhurried night settling gently down around you and carrying you at last all the way down into sleep.